Hey guys, you are watching your anime world. How are you all? Please support to subscribe this channel for watching new interesting stories. So in this video, we will see what if Deku became the master of Git Quirk. Here is short summary. Midoriya Izuku's Quirk is Git, the distributed version control system designed to track changes in source code and resolve conflicts in nonlinear development workflows. But before we start, if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to subscribe and like this video. And if possible, share this video with your friends. Now let's start the story. Mommy. Izuku barreled into the living room with all the grace and poise expected from an enthusiastic 4-year-old. I got my quirk. I finally got my quirk. That's wonderful, sweetie. Midoriya Inko scooped up Izuku in a big hug, twirling in circles while her boy giggled. Tell me all about it. Izuku twitched his nose in thought. I don't really know. I see something, kinda. I don't, really see it. It's words, and I don't see the words, but they're in my mind. I don't really get what it says. Izuku's voice got quieter as he talked, suddenly feeling bad that he didn't know what his own quirk was. That's okay, honey. Whatever you're seeing, how about you read it out to me, and I'll help you. Izuku nodded multiple times like a bobblehead. Right, so, the start says, thank you for installing Git, and then I don't get a lot of the other words. What's it mean, mommy? Inko tilted her head, and then she smiled. I'm not sure either, sweetie. I guess we'll just have to discover it together. How about I make an appointment with the quirk doctor? Yeah, why don't you write down what you see, even if you don't know what the words mean, so that the doctor can help? I'll get my notebook. Izuku barreled back into his room to grab his notebook and some crayons. He finally had his quirk. He was the last in his class to get it, but that just meant his quirk was going to be the most awesome of all. He could feel it. Well, your son's quirk is certainly unusual. I looked into everything as best as I could, but there was only so much I could do. Inko and her son sat facing the quirk therapist, Dr. Kono Terua. It took some time, Dr. Kono continued, but we were able to find a few references to the computer program that little Izuku's quirk is referring to. Do you know about the Great Data Crash of 2035? Inko shuffled in her seat. It sounds familiar. I'm afraid it's been over a decade since my high school history classes. The doctor nodded. Right. To summarize, in the late 20th to early 21st century, the world transitioned to storing information digitally rather than using physical copies. When society fell apart during the early Quirk Wars, the servers and infrastructure that stored that information broke down. It took decades for society to rebuild, but by that time most of that infrastructure was lost. Some information was preserved, but we don't know a lot about the 50 or so years prior to the dawn of quirks. Izuku swung his legs back and forth on the chair. He was trying to follow what the doctor was saying, and he was a bit distressed that he was already getting lost. His mom patted him on his head and responded. And this has something to do with my son's quirk. Yes, specifically, the quirk is referring to a computer program that existed during that time. The program itself was lost in the data crash, but references to it still exist in archives. It was apparently called Git. To our best understanding, it was a program to help programmers collaborate on work. It kept track of when new lines of code were added, who wrote it, and such and such. And, how exactly is Izuku's quirk a computer program? What does this mean? Dr. Kono slumped in his chair. That, I don't have an answer for. Presumably, your son's quirk will replicate the functionality of this Git in some way, but this is an unusual situation, and I can't help as much as I would want to. I do have some good news though. The doctor picked up a binder he had on his desk. Surprisingly, one of the few things related to Git that survived the data crash was an incomplete user manual. I took the liberty of printing it all out and collecting it here. He patted the binder in his hands. My quirk already has instructions. Izuku jumped up from his seat in excitement. That was so cool. He'd been planning to write about his quirk in his hero notebook, of course, but to think that so much of it was already done. The binder in the doctor's hands had so many pages. All the other kids in his class had already had their quirks for months. He needed to catch up to everyone. The doctor looked embarrassed and slightly sad. Unfortunately, again, it's not as helpful as you might think. It's clearly missing a lot of sections, and it's not written in Japanese and no translations are available, but, to be frank, those are the least of my concerns. Izuku let out a disappointed whine. I can't read this. Is this in English? That's debatable. The doctor sighed. Izuku frowned. He was going to fall even further behind Kachan if he couldn't read the instructions for his own quirk. But, that was okay. No one said being a hero was easy. If this is what he needed to do to become a hero, he'd learn every language in the world. And anyway, All Might knew English, so learning it would just make him closer to All Might. I'm going to learn English, and then I'll understand my quirk. Izuku pumped his tiny fist in the air. The doctor looked at Izuku with pity. I'm so sorry. Tick-tock, tick-tock. 14-year-old Izuku stared at the wall clock, waiting impatiently for the end of the school day. Tick-tock, 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 tick-tock. Bri I Nung GG. Don't forget, all of you need to hand in your high school application forms by next Monday. The teacher tried to shout over the class of unruly kids who were excited for the weekend. The bell that signaled the end of the day had rung, and no one was planning to stay in the school a moment more than necessary. Izuku felt that more than most. 10 years. 10 pointless, wasted years. He was running out of time. He was running out of time. Izuku tried to slip out with the rest of the horde of kids exiting the classroom door, but he stopped when he felt a hand grasp him around the back of his collar. Where do you think you're going, huh? With a grimace, Izuku shook off the hand and turned to face his bullies. He expected this, of course. There was no way they would let him escape in peace. There were 3 of them today. Katsuki, obviously, the only one who really mattered. Then there were 2 others looming behind him, trying to look cool. Or something. Izuku didn't really care. What do you want, Kachan? Katsuki snarled. You think you can take that tone with me, Deku? There wasn't really a right answer to that question. Izuku decided to stay silent. You're pathetic, you know that. Katsuki continued, slowly stepping forward to take up more and more of Izuku's space. Too busy dreaming to face reality. You're such a embarrassment. Definitely the words of a hero. You're going to be so popular at UA. Oh no, he said that out loud. Why did he say that out loud? Curse his stupid mouth. I'm going to be the greatest hero ever. Katsuki roared. Don't you dare look down on me. Izuku started to respond, but he was cut off by Katsuki getting right up in his face, the threat of violence implicit in his rejection of personal space. You're never going to be a hero, Deku. Don't even think about applying to UA. I'm the only one from this school who's getting in, and I don't want a pathetic loser like you following me around trying to ride my coattails. As if. I'm going to avoid you as much as physically possible at the exams. Okay, Kachan, I won't apply to UA. I promise. Can I go now? Izuku struggled to keep a straight face as he saw Katsuki experience a whirl of emotions, the gears in his head turning as he tried to parse the nonsense that Izuku just said. After a brief pause, his expression became thunderous and he roared, Don't lie to me, you bastard. Drat, it was worth a shot. With a sharp grin, Katsuki continued, Not that being a liar is anything new for you, you quirkless piece of shit. He looked smug. Izuku's comeback had backfired a bit, and he knew it. I'm not quirkless, Izuku mumbled. Oh yeah, prove it. And there was the rub. Breathe in, breathe out. Breathe in, breathe out. Izuku's chest heaved and his feet pounded against the sand as he jogged up and down the edge of a beach. A while ago he read about how jogging on sand gave you a much better workout than on pavement, and since then he changed his jogging route to pass by the nearby trash heap, beach. His altercation with Katsuki and his minions wasn't as bad as he was dreading. Apparently, even they valued their weekend more than they enjoyed tormenting Izuku, and they weren't willing to hang around the school longer than necessary. Katsuki stormed out before long, and then the remaining goons spent only a few more minutes pathetically trying to insult Izuku's face, odor, life choices, genetic history, etc., before they got bored and wanted to go home. Small blessings. He'd started working out a year ago. He didn't go to the gym or anything, that was too expensive, but he had a set of weights and the internet, and that was good enough. He had an epiphany one morning that if the day came when he finally figured out his quirk, but he failed the hero exam because he was too physically weak, then he might as well just crawl into a hole and die. So ever since then, he made sure to stay in shape in preparation for the day he'd finally learn to use his quirk. His quirk. His goddamn stupid quirk. He tried to hide from Katsuki how much the quirkless jabs hurt him, how much it stabbed at his deepest fears, but it didn't matter. He knew that Kachan knew. At 4 years old, he apparently saw some sort of pop-up when he got his quirk. And then it never happened again. He didn't actually remember the original event anymore, he was too young. He remembered it, but it was more like he remembered remembering it. It was an impactful moment of his young life and something he'd thought about over and over and over. He remembered all the times he'd remembered it. But the day itself, if he were asked to describe what the pop-up looked like and what it said, he could tell you, but only because he knew how 4-year-old Izuku had described it. But the original memory was gone. He'd spent so many sleepless nights with ugly thoughts swirling in his mind. Did it even happen? Was he making it all up? Did he have a quirk at all? But no, he knew he had a quirk. Whether he remembered it properly or not, 4-year-old him had named some stupid program that really did exist, and one that he had no possible way of knowing about. It was real. He just didn't know what the hell to do next. Nothing worked. Nothing helped. He'd spent so many years learning English and trying to decipher the user manual, only to discover that 1, it was practically gibberish, and 2, it was a manual for a computer program. He was a human being. What was he supposed to do? Where was he supposed to enter the commands? There were a lot of avenues to try, and by God he'd tried every single one of them. Obviously, he tried experimenting with an actual computer. That went nowhere. Picturing stuff in his head never worked. In the VR games he played there were a lot of different ways to bring up the menu, such as making a certain hand motion or staring at a specific spot in space. He'd hoped that a screen would appear in front of him in real life if he just figured out the correct action, but no luck so far. Judging by the manual, Git was a command line program. It was apparently some ancient computer interface where you did stuff by typing specific words rather than tapping on icons. Like, instead of clicking a button you'd type, click button, or something. He didn't entirely understand, and most records from that time period were lost in the data crash, so he never would fully understand. So, given that, he supposed that there might be some magic words that would start the program, that was his quirk. And then he would say those words, or think them, or write them down, or something. And then it would work. But of course, if these magic words existed, then it was missing from the half-complete dog-eared user manual stuffed in a drawer in his room. Which meant it could be anything. UA entrance exams were less than a year away. And it had already been 10 years. His quirk was a mystery inside an enigma wrapped in a command prompt, and he was running out of time. He was running out of time. Breathe in, breathe out. He had reached a part of the beach that wasn't entirely covered in mountains of trash, enough that he could see the ocean cut across the brilliant golden sky. The sun was starting to set. It was time to go home soon. Mom would worry if he stayed out too late. Izuku stopped jogging and began his cool-down walk. Between breaths, he started his ritual muttering. Start Git, open Git, start program Git, begin Git, start, Git open, run Git begin, Git run, Git new. He'd done this countless times in the past. If there really were magic words that would give him a quirk, then he'd just have to try every word. In every language he could think of. It had never worked before, and it almost certainly never would, but he couldn't bear to do nothing. Launch Git launch, go Git Git go, Git commence, initial Git, commence Git, turn on Git, load Git load, Git log in Git, log into Git. Leaving the beach, Izuku started heading for the nearby bus stop. The bus dropped him off almost right outside his apartment, which is why he chose this route. With the setting sun at his back, his shadow stretched long in front of him on the glimmering sidewalk. Boot up Git boot, compute Git input, Git input, Git in, Git help, Git Git shit. Intro git. Initialize git. Init git. Git initialize. Git init. Git create. Izuku jerked to a stop, almost falling over himself. He brought a hand to his mouth. Something was different about that last one. His tongue felt weird, like it had moved in a way that it was never meant to. He didn't understand. He felt almost dizzy. And then he saw something. Except he didn't see it. He'd forgotten this. 4-year-old Izuku hadn't known how to describe it, but now he remembered how it felt. He didn't see it. He was reading words, but he wasn't reading, and they weren't words. It wasn't Japanese, or English, or anything. It was just meaning, plastered directly against his brain. Chapter text. It was time. Izuku felt his skin buzz in excitement, in impatience, in anxiety, in fear. On his desk in front of him were 2 items. The first was a brand new blank analysis notebook. This deserved a new notebook more than anything else in the world. The second was the beaten-up old binder that was his Quirk's instruction manual, the margin of every page filled to the brim with notes, a lot of them written in crayon. He didn't take as good care of the binder as he probably should have when he was younger. He'd been ridiculously tempted to start experimenting with his Quirk immediately back near the beach, but he'd held back. Generally speaking, despite the laws against public Quirk use, you could get away with it as long as your Quirk wasn't obstructive and it didn't affect other people. But experimenting with a Quirk with unknown capabilities in public, hoo boy, the dumb teenager excuse wouldn't get him far. If he were caught, he would have been in massive trouble. So despite every fiber of his being needing to finally use his Quirk, he sat there at the bus stop, shaking in his seat. When the bus came, he got on and found a spot to sit, shaking in his seat. And now he was finally home, in his bedroom, in front of his desk, shaking in his seat. It was time. He knew what he had to do now. Vocal commands worked. He'd read the user manual front to back hundreds of times over the years, and while there were a lot of sections missing, he had memorized a lot of commands that ought to work. The reason they never worked before was because his Quirk hadn't been initialized, but now the commands had something to apply to. They should work. Probably. Hopefully. Please, 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 please. He was so scared. Planting his arms against his desk in front of him for support, Izuku took a deep breath and announced, "Status." Nothing happened. It felt like a hole had been carved out of his gut. He could feel his heart rate increase. His head started to get hot and his breathing had become sharp and ragged. Status. Git status. The feeling of his tongue twisting back on itself in an alien, unnatural way was the most pleasant sensation he had ever felt in his entire life. He still had a Quirk. It was real. He leaned back in his chair and tried to get control of his breathing. 10 seconds into his Quirk experimentation and he was already hot and breathing heavily as if he had just finished a long workout. Okay. Pull it together, Izuku. Don't let your stupid anxiety ruin the best day of your life. Right. Okay. No screwing around. He had a Quirk now and it was about time that he got to use it. A message had been burned into his brain when he had spoken the status command. He blushed when he read, all_might_undergarments. Wait, why was he embarrassed? No one else could read this but him, and he knew what clothes he was wearing. Like, that was objectively the least interesting thing written here. For example, that was a very, very large number at the bottom there. The implications of which were, too much for his brain right now. Put a pin in that one for some other day. All right, time to see if all that time poring over the user manual was worth it. The basic idea behind Git was that it allowed programmers to save and share the revision history of their code. So, it was kind of like creating a save point in a video game. Each save was added to that file's timeline, and the user was free to reload to any point in the timeline. If multiple people were editing the same files, then you could create multiple timelines, branches, where the file existed in multiple different states simultaneously. The first line, on branch main. He shivered in excitement. He was so looking forward to making branches. That would have to come later though. For now, it was telling him he was on the main branch. Simple enough. The next line was, no commits yet. That was also obvious. Well, obvious if you knew what a commit was. A commit was the name for a save point. The third section, this was interesting. Izuku tapped his pencil absent-mindedly against his notebook. His All Might pencil. It wasn't anything special, really, just a normal pencil with All Might's color scheme. The eraser at the tip was colored yellow as if it were a tuft of All Might's hair. He had a few more of this exact kind of pencil in his desk drawer. After a moment's thought, Izuku placed the pencil down on his desk and stared at it with conviction. Get at All Might pencil. He already knew that it hadn't worked before he had finished speaking the command. The words sounded natural while under the effect of his quirk, but he sounded stupid otherwise. He felt his heart rate start to increase again, which further added to his stress. No, stop it, God, why am I like this? Swallowing, Izuku touched the pencil with the tip of his index finger and tried again. Get at all_might_pencil. Oh, thank goodness. Okay, Izuku, let's not dwell on the fact that I'm apparently one slight inconvenience away from a panic attack. Focus. What had changed now that he added the pencil? Get status. That made sense based on his understanding of how this all worked. Multiple things could be included in a single save point, a single commit, and his pencil was now one of the things that would be included in his next save. Izuku picked up the pencil to see if there was anything different about it. After looking at it from all angles, he concluded that it was the same as it had always been. He went to place it back on his desk and, oh shit. A transparent copy of the pencil was sitting on the desk in exactly the spot that he had picked it up from. Izuku's eyes widened. He went to touch it, but his fingers passed straight through it. It was intangible, like a hologram. A smile slowly spread across Izuku's face. His quirk was doing something. This was the first time his quirk affected something that wasn't entirely inside his own head. Oh wait, actually, Izuku dug his phone out of his pocket and opened up the camera app. When looking at his desk through the viewfinder, the transparent pencil wasn't visible. Huh, okay, maybe it still was inside his own head, at least for now. It was probably the case that only he could see the virtual pencil. He'd ask his mom about it later. The key word there was, later. His mom was going to make it a big emotional episode when he told her he'd finally figured out his quirk. Which was nice, don't get him wrong, but it was going to be a time-consuming emotional episode and he didn't have the time for that right now. His pencil was listed twice now. Once in the list of things that would be included in the next commit, and also in the list of things that would not be committed. Izuku looked back and forth between the transparent pencil on his desk and the real, solid pencil still in his hand. It makes sense, actually, Izuku decided after thinking about it for a moment. There are two entries because there are two pencils. The bottom one says, modified, so that's probably the solid one that I can move around. The other one is intangible, so I can't touch it or modify it. The status screen had already suggested the next command he should try, so he went for it. Get restore all_might_pencil. In an instant, the pencil disappeared from Izuku's hand and reappeared on his desk, perfectly overlapping the virtual pencil. Holy crap, Izuku burst up from his desk. He just had too much energy to sit still right now. With a massive grin on his face, Izuku started pacing around his bedroom, almost hopping from foot to foot. That was teleportation. Just that, and nothing else, was the quirk of a pro hero. There were so many possibilities for rescue and reconnaissance alone. And it was instant, with possibly no limit on the number of objects, or the size or weight, and possibly even no range limit. He couldn't even think of a quirk like that without a range limit. Oh my god, could he use his quirk on living people? That was an endless rabbit hole all by itself. And it wasn't just teleportation. Izuku scrambled to his desk and picked up the pencil. Like before, a transparent virtual pencil was left behind on his desk. Good to know, so that meant that it was still waiting for him to make his first commit. Oh man, he hadn't even made his first commit yet. In a moment, he had an idea, and it took priority. Part of him felt like it was too crazy to be possible, but he was almost completely confident that it would work. Izuku snapped the pencil in half. Fingers trembling, He placed the 2 broken pieces on his desk next to the virtual pencil. As expected, the virtual pencil was still whole and unchanged. Git restore all _might pencil, Izuku said. The 2 broken halves of the pencil vanished, and the newly repaired whole pencil reappeared in the location of the virtual pencil. Izuku squealed with glee. After spending some time jumping around his room and chattering to himself, it was back to business. There was still so much he needed to do. Sure, his quirk was complicated and it would take a while for him to fully understand it. The user manual was a testament to that, but he'd barely scratched the surface so far. He still hadn't even made a commit. Oh, and he needed to talk to Mom. She didn't know he'd figured out his quirk. He'd talk to her. He would. Soon. Just not yet. There were more things he needed to try first. Izuku sat back down at his desk. Let the quirk testing continue. The next thing to try was obvious. He'd already thought about it a couple of times. It was time to make his first commit. Commits were the backbone of his quirk. They were the official, save points, permanent records that he'd be able to access for the rest of his life, in theory. It was kind of lame that his first irreversible imprint on the timeline of the world was going to be the location of a pencil, but hey, he had to start somewhere. Looking down at the solid pencil and the virtual pencil next to each other on the desk in front of him, Izuku announced, "Git commit." The next thing that happened wasn't what Izuku expected. His mind's eye was taken over completely by blank whiteness. It was similar to how he saw the words in his mind, but it was just blank. Like a fresh piece of paper, waiting to be used for something. He felt an urge, a sense of indistinct anticipation. What was going on? Oh, he was being dumb. The manual explained this, but he forgot about it in his eagerness. For each commit, you had to provide a description of what that commit was. Like, why you made it, and what you changed. Which made sense because if you had a lot of commits then it'd be hard to find the one you wanted otherwise. The blank sheet in his mind was waiting for him to give an appropriate message. Wait, he wasn't ready. This was his very first commit. He should have something cool to say. Like, when Neil Armstrong first stepped onto the moon, he had a good quote ready. He didn't say, "That shuttle was so cramped. Man, I'm hungry." Izuku needed something good, too. He couldn't think, though. The blank whiteness was pulsing in his mind impatiently. He was already taking too long. Okay, look, I'm not going to think of something profound in the next 2 seconds, and I'm literally the only person who's ever going to see this. Keep it simple. This is my first commit, so just say that. This is my first commit, Izuku said weakly. Izuku was horrified by what he saw written on the blank paper in his mind. No, don't record my stuttering. His face fell into his hands and he groaned. Ugh, how do I make this stop? He waited a moment, leaning back on his chair with his hands covering his face. Soon enough, a new message appeared in his mind. Izuku was mortified. He'd have to live with this for the rest of his life. Every time he viewed his list of commits, it would be there, right at the beginning. Was there a way to change the message of a commit? There was nothing in the manual about it, but was that because it wasn't possible, or was it because that section of the manual was missing? Was it worth dropping everything he was doing to reread the manual cover to cover yet again in the desperate hope that he missed something the first million times he read it? There was a saying, comedy equals tragedy plus time. Was that the case here? Decades from now, when he was old and gray, would he look back on his first commit message and chuckle with fond nostalgic amusement? Perhaps. On the other hand, comedy equals tragedy plus time, was also how Izuku had justified every school day he'd had for years. Years from now, when he and Kachan were pro-heroes together, they'd look back and laugh at the innocence of their youth, all of the insults, all of the beatings, all of Izuku's desperate misery as he tried and tried and tried. Damn it, pull it together. This was not the time for another depressive spiral. Literally just a few minutes ago Izuku was so happy and excited that he was bouncing around the room because he couldn't keep still. That was more like it. Let's do more of that. All right. Izuku slapped his cheeks. Putting aside the message for now, I've made my first commit. What's changed? He looked down at his desk. The solid pencil hadn't changed. Oh, but the virtual pencil had disappeared. Things looked normal again. How did that affect the commands he'd been using so far? Git restore all _might pencil, Izuku said. The pencil disappeared and reappeared in the location that the virtual pencil was in before, even though the virtual pencil was no longer visible. It worked exactly the same as it had before. Right, okay, this makes sense, Izuku thought, strumming his fingers on his desk. The transparency thing is basically showing me a preview of what my next save point will look like. But once it's committed, the save point is invisible, and there's no indication of where it is. I guess that's understandable since I'm going to be making new commits all my life, so things would get cluttered if they were all visible to me at the same time, but, yeah, I'm going to need a lot of notebooks to keep track of all this. Izuku picked up the pencil and moved it to the exact center of his desk. Git add all _might pencil. Picking it up, he saw that it left behind a virtual pencil. Yep, same as before. He placed the pencil down again, now at the far edge of his desk. Git add all _might pencil. Upon saying the command, the virtual pencil in the center of his desk disappeared. Once again, he picked up the pencil, and he saw that it left behind a virtual pencil on the far edge of his desk. This was what Izuku expected. Each time he added the pencil, it updated the location of the preview that showed what his next commit would contain. The transparent objects were temporary by nature. He was free to play around as much as he wanted without the commitment of a permanent record that he would live with forever. Git restore all _might pencil. Again, as expected, the pencil disappeared from Izuku's hand and reappeared at the far edge of his desk, overlapping the virtual pencil. But how was Izuku supposed to restore it back to the location the pencil was in when it was committed? Git restore all _might pencil, he tried. No change. The pencil stayed exactly where it was. Git status. Well, it was nice that his Quirk was willing to give him help, after completely failing to do so for 10 years. Git restore, staged all _might pencil. Ew. Those dashes tasted weird in his mouth. His tongue wasn't designed to make those shapes. Nothing seemed to change at first, but when Izuku picked up the pencil he noticed that it no longer left behind a virtual pencil. Alright, so that command was how you removed virtual objects that you didn't want anymore. And if there weren't any virtual objects getting in the way, git restore all _might pencil. The pencil disappeared from Izuku's hands and reappeared on the right side of his desk, precisely where he had previously committed it. Cool. Well, that was one way to do it, although it would only work for the most recent commit. Once he made more commits, he'd have to figure out how to specify individual ones. He'd leave that for later though. First, he had to. Wait a minute. Izuku's thoughts halted as he suddenly realized an inconsistency. When I first added my pencil, I had to physically touch it. It didn't work when I just spoke the command alone. But since then I've added my pencil multiple times without touching it. Time for another test. Izuku around for something to try it with, and he saw the blank, unopened Quirk analysis notebook in front of him on his desk. Oh yeah, he was supposed to be writing all this stuff down, wasn't he? His pencil was supposed to be used for, writing, but instead it had become the main subject of his experiments. Oh well, he'd do that soon, just later. If nothing else he should start writing a list of everything that he was putting off for later. Later. Izuku held his hands in the air so that he wasn't touching anything. Git add analysis n. Okay, I can already tell that's not working. He then placed his index finger on the cover of the notebook. Git add analysis _notebook. He slid the notebook to the other side of his desk, and a transparent notebook was left behind. He lifted his hands so that he wasn't touching anything, then tried again. Git add analysis _notebook. The commands were working. The virtual notebook's location updated to the real notebook's location. So, the first time I add an object to my Quirk I have to touch it, but every time after that I can just use its name. Cool. But what if he had multiple objects with the same name? He had multiple All Might pencils in his desk drawer, after all. So many endless questions. He really did get the perfect kind of quirk for his personality, didn't he? He'd be able to experiment for years and still probably discover new things. That said, he should probably start winding this down soon, though. After all, he still had to tell Mom about everything. He hadn't written anything in his notebook yet either, although that could wait until tomorrow. He should probably do most of his experimenting only once he was prepared to take it seriously and record his observations. Thank goodness he had the whole weekend ahead of him. So yeah, he'd learned enough for now. He should probably let Mom know about all this. One more thing. One more thing, then he'd tell Mom. There was one more thing he just had to try. He had to. He'd been waiting for most of his life to try this, ever since he had first learned just enough English to kinda barely understand what the manual was talking about. When he was a young kid and his classmates asked him about his quirk, his problem wasn't just that he didn't know how to use it, it was also that he didn't know what his quirk was supposed to be in the first place. Hi, I'm Hannah. What's your name? Look at this. I can make flowers bloom and make them any color. What's your quirk? Hi, I'm Izuku. Your quirk is so cool. I can't use my quirk. Why not? I don't know what it is. He wasn't surprised that his classmates eventually decided that he was a big fat liar pretending that he had a quirk. Sometimes Izuku even felt the same way. He couldn't answer what his quirk was, or when he'd be able to show them it, or why he wasn't able to use it, or even what his quirk was supposed to do if he could use it. So when he had learned enough English to barely comprehend bits and pieces of the highly technical gobbledygook written in the manual, he wanted so badly to come up with a good answer to the question, what's your quirk? And between his poor understanding of the concepts within and his desperation to make it all worth it, he latched on to the coolest sounding concept written within those pages. I can make alternate timelines. That was his answer. Sure, in follow-up questions he'd have to admit that he didn't know how to actually do it, but he insisted that his quirk was that he could create alternate timelines. It was by far the coolest quirk he'd ever heard of, and it was his. His classmates didn't believe him one bit, of course. It was an even dumber sounding lie than claiming that he didn't know what his own quirk did. But Izuku latched on to it regardless. It meant something special to him. It meant something special because, despite what Kachan thought, Izuku knew he wasn't lying. It truly was his quirk. Once he figured it out, he'd be able to do it. He had so many daydreams of one day showing them all, at long last proving everyone wrong. Which made it a little disheartening when some years later, after his understanding of both English and Git jargon had increased, he came to understand that the branches described in the user manual didn't work anything at all like the alternate timelines he had bragged about. Hopefully, no one remembered his wild claims about how, in the future, he'd be a pro-hero who could defeat villains by making timelines where they never became villains in the first place. But whatever, branches were still amazingly cool. And now it was time. He'd been waiting for this all his life. It was finally happening. He was going to make a goddamn alternate timeline. The user manual was unnecessary for this, he knew the commands by heart. Currently, he was on the main branch, Git branch normal pencil. That command would create a new branch, a new alternate timeline, branching off from main. Git branch broken pencil, and this would create a second branch, also splitting off from the main branch. Git switch normal pencil, this switched him from the main branch to the normal pencil branch. Nothing had changed in the room around him, which was obvious. All of the timelines would remain identical until he made changes to them. Izuku once again moved his pencil to the center of the desk. Git add all _might pencil. Then, git commit. The blank whiteness appeared in his mind. Right, this again. He was pretty sure that he was doing something wrong here. He knew that the manual had described a way to include the message in the command itself, but it had never seemed important to him, so it had slipped his mind. Another thing to figure out later. A normal, unbroken pencil. Chapter text. Izuku swept his gaze across his audience, eager eyes awaiting his performance. Okay, his audience was just his mom, but still. Git restore teacup, Izuku proclaimed with great theatricality, waving his arms around pointlessly. Mom gasped when the teacup teleported from one end of the kitchen table to the other. Also of note was that the tea within the teacup remained perfectly still and untouched, with no indication that it had been moved. Teleportation and other rapid movement quirks were notoriously turbulent. You'd usually never want to use a teleportation quirk on a teacup like that unless you were fine with the tea spilling everywhere. The fact that Izuku could move it while keeping the tea completely undisturbed was an impressive showcase. Fine, Izuku knew that he promised himself that his experiment with branches would be the last thing he tested before telling his mom everything, but he lied. Sue him. He first tested this with his water bottle in his room. Was it so wrong to want to show off? So, what do you think? Izuku grinned. His mom responded by scooping him up in a big hug. Your quirk is wonderful, sweetie. I'm so happy for you. It can do a lot more than that, too, Izuku said into his mom's shoulder. I can't wait to see it. Mom started rubbing his back. Is it everything you hoped for? Izuku smiled. Yeah, it is. Mom returned the smile. I'm glad. I'm so glad. He and his mom stayed embraced for a little bit, appreciating the moment together. I think we need to celebrate, his mom said, pulling herself from the hug. It's getting late, but the supermarket should still be open. Let's go buy a cake. That was a fantastic idea. Yeah, the late evening walk was nice. The sun had set a while ago, but it wasn't fully dark out yet. Izuku spent most of the time rambling to his mom about everything he had figured out so far and all the ideas he had in mind. His mom made sure to respond with the appropriate earnest and inquisitive noises. They spent very little time at the store, picking out a soufflé-style cheesecake before heading home. It was getting late after all. Izuku continued right where he left off during the walk home. He knew that his mom wasn't perfectly following the intricacies of how each Git command affected staged objects in different contexts, but he appreciated the effort all the same. Arriving back home, Izuku washed his hands while his mom pulled out some plates and set the cake on the kitchen table. It's getting pretty late, Mom said when Izuku returned to the kitchen. I think you should only have a very small slice. It's not good to eat sugar at this time of night. But this is your big day, so you can take whatever you feel like having. Aren't you having any, Mom? Oh no, this is all for you. I've been thinking of going on a diet, so I won't be having sweets like this for a while. I have an idea about that. Good thing he had just washed his hands. He leaned forward and touched the side of the cake with the tip of his finger. Git add, cake, okay. That didn't work. Git status. Izuku paused and stared at the list in his mind. One conspicuous item on the list, to be specific. Well, he had wondered about it. In fact, many of his ideas about how he would use his power for heroics had assumed that he was capable of it, but it seemed so much more disconcerting now that it was in front of his face. The text, Midoriya_Inko, sitting so innocently amongst the other items in his immediate surroundings, well, that was quite the rabbit hole. Just, the implications of such a power. Could he bring back the dead? How would you test something like that? No, he wouldn't want to test that. He hoped it was something he would never have to test. Are you okay, sweetie? Mom asked with a tone of worry. Existential thoughts for later, Izuku. Yeah, I'm fine. Git add cotton_cheesecake. With that, Izuku picked up his fork and proudly stuck it directly into the full cheesecake, not bothering to cut himself a slice first. With a mighty heave, he scooped up a giant heap of cheesecake and shoveled it directly into his face. He was chewing and grinning at the same time. It was delicious. He picked the right dessert. And there was more where that came from. Swallowing his first big bite, Izuku took his fork and attacked the cheesecake again. This was fun. As Izuku continued to shovel heap after heap of cheesecake into his mouth, his mom was looking more and more concerned. Izuku, sweetie, I know I said I wouldn't stop you from celebrating however you wanted, but don't you think this is a bit much? Izuku held up a finger to wait for a moment. His mouth was too stuffed with cake to talk. After swallowing, he grinned cheekily. No, Mom, think about it. Watch this. Git restore cotton_cheesecake. The half-eaten cake on the table reverted back to its pristine state. At the same time, Izuku let out a loud and awkwardly long belch that echoed around the kitchen. He held up a hand to cover his mouth, face heating up. Oh man, he was glad it was just his mom here because that was pretty embarrassing. Thankfully, his mom was more focused on the cake that had reappeared. A light had seemed to go off in her head. Izuku, are you saying? The burping was probably because the cake in my stomach suddenly got replaced with air. I didn't really think it through totally. But yeah, you got it. No need to worry about calories anymore. Izuku grabbed another fork and offered it to his mom. Your turn. His mom gingerly took the fork, looking back and forth between it and the cheesecake. But whatever internal debate she was having came to an abrupt conclusion because she too stabbed her fork into the cake and took a big bite. Izuku watched his mom tackle the dessert. She certainly wasn't as violent about it as Izuku was when he devoured half the cake in less than a minute, but she was smiling, and he was glad to see mom enjoying herself. After a few minutes, his mom placed her fork down and wiped her mouth. It looked like she was done for now. Get restore cotton_cheesecake. The cake reappeared, and on cue, his mom also let out a big, long burp. Oh dear. Mom's face turned faintly red. Good, now both of them could be embarrassed. Pretty great, right? Izuku looked proud. His mom laughed. Your quirk is the best, Izuku. Yep, it sure was. Today was a great day, the best day, but all days had to end eventually. Izuku was back in his bedroom after brushing his teeth and changing into his pajamas. He stared at his bed with wariness. Getting to sleep tonight was going to be a complete nightmare, he knew it. How could he possibly get to sleep when there was so much stuff he still wanted to do? He hadn't even scratched the surface of his quirk's capabilities. He was probably going to lie there all night, mind-worrying, coming up with all sorts of ideas and wanting to try them out, or at least write them down. The only silver lining was he had the whole weekend ahead of him. Thank God tomorrow wasn't a school day. If he had to go to school tomorrow morning and sit there quietly all day, he would just die. As much as he wanted to stay up all night and play with his quirk, he knew he had to try to get to sleep. Izuku was never very good at all-nighters. He always felt like crap the next day. He had a full free day to experiment as much as he wanted tomorrow, and he knew he'd regret it if he wasted that time by feeling sluggish and terrible. There was one thing though. Just one, he promised himself. One thing he absolutely, positively had to check before going to bed. He'd never fall asleep otherwise. There was no way. That line from before, Midoriya_Inko. It had made him think of something. He wasn't sure if it would work or not. He wasn't sure if he wanted it to work or not, but he had to know. Right now. Get add Midoriya Izuku. And, that was a no-go. Izuku's shoulders slumped in, disappointment. Relief. He wasn't sure. If he were able to use his quirk on himself, that opened up so many possibilities. He could heal his own injuries, or teleport around the place, or maybe even send himself back in time. But, in a way, it was reassuring as well that he'd never have to concern himself with that. His quirk was complicated enough as it was. And, well, it was awkward enough seeing his mom casually listed among the objects that he could control. He wasn't sure how he would feel if his quirk also listed himself as one of the objects that it could manipulate as it saw fit. That was enough existentialism for one day. It was time for bed. Izuku woke up groggily. Well, he slept at least, although it was hardly a good sleep. He was thinking about his quirk all night, and then he was dreaming about his quirk all night. He woke up so many times it was hard to tell the difference between his thoughts and his dreams. There was so much he needed to try. Not just the dozens of other commands listed in the manual, but a whole lot of totally obvious things that he was shocked he didn't think of last night. Why did he never think of placing something in that same spot as a virtual object before restoring it? What would happen when two items tried to exist in the same spot at the same time? So many questions, so much to do. Izuku rose out of bed, rubbing his tired eyes. Course, he had to wake up first. And there was a lot more to do in the morning. Brush his teeth, have a shower, get dressed, eat breakfast. Oh no, he had to do his morning workout too. He glared at the weight set propped up against his bedroom wall. maybe he'd skip it today. Exercise ed at the best of times, let alone when he'd be rushing to get it over with. No, he shouldn't think like that. He had a quirk now. He was going to be a hero, for real. Not just hoping, not just dreaming. UA's entrance exams were less than a year away. If anything, he needed to put his workout routine on overdrive, not start skipping days like a lazy butt. He'd learned last night that he couldn't add himself to his quirk. That meant that he had no physical advantages, and he couldn't restore any injuries he sustained. As incredible as his quirk was, his body was a big weak point. One solid punch to the face from a villain would incapacitate him. There was a reason many of the top heroes had body-enhancing quirks of some kind. He'd been taking self-defense classes for a while, but that wasn't enough. He needed to be in tip-top physical condition if he wanted to keep up with all of his future classmates. Izuku slapped his cheeks. All right, workout first. Don't skimp, do it properly. Then shower and breakfast, and then I've got the rest of the day to myself. He was going to be a hero. Izuku sat at the kitchen table, twirling his All Might pencil in his hand. He'd decided to relocate to the living room for the day's experiments. He was alone in the apartment since his mom was out running errands, and his room was kind of dark in the morning because his window faced away from the sun. It was nicer out here. His quirk analysis notebook and the Git reference manual lay open in front of him along with an assortment of other household items he'd haphazardly grabbed. His eyes were drawn to his quirk analysis notebook. The completely blank quirk analysis notebook. The one he'd specifically gotten to record everything he learned about his quirk. First things first, time to start writing stuff down. I have time, so I can do this more systematically today. With the reference open in front of him like a study guide, Izuku spent the next 40 minutes or so dutifully writing down everything he had learned so far in his notebook. He split his notes into 3 main sections. First, a record of the experiments he had performed last night, including the commands he used and the text responses his quirk gave him for each command. He followed this with a list of new experiments that he wanted to perform. Second, notes on each command he knew about. This was by far the largest section because this was where he listed all his ideas so far for how he'd use his quirk as a pro hero. He cross-referenced the Git manual a lot here, noting down the many commands he still needed to try. His entry for Git init was mostly an angry rant about how unfair it was that his reference manual just so happened to be missing the most important command of all. The rant continued into a despairful realization that if a command that important was missing, then how many other essential aspects of his quirk were missing that he'd never know about. Anyway, the last section was a simple checklist of his plans for today, and probably for the following days too, depending on how long the list got. Yesterday night he had thought many times, I'll figure that out later. This time, he'd add a new item to his checklist each time he thought that. Izuku put his pencil down. Wow, that had taken him longer than he thought. He flipped through his notebook and saw just how many pages he'd already written. Damn, if this was what he had so far, he'd need multiple notebooks for just his quirk alone. Considering how thick the incomplete reference manual was, that made sense. Izuku cracked his knuckles. It was time for the fun part. He looked at the first item on his checklist. Hollow square with rounded corners, objects with the same name. This was a basic aspect of his quirk that he needed to have clarified. When I first add an object to my quirk, I have to both touch it and say its name. But after adding an item once, I can use my quirk on it without touching it, like when I say, git restore whatever. But what happens if I add 2 objects with the same name and then try using commands without touching either of them? He had 2 identical unused chopsticks on the table in front of him to test this with. The codes after the names distinguished objects that had the same name. He knew that already. He shifted the first chopstick a bit so that the transparent, staged, chopstick was visible. As he learned yesterday, adding the chopstick again would update the position of the virtual chopstick. He lifted his hands so that he was touching neither chopstick and said, git add chopstick. Oh, he was kind of hoping for an error message that would tell him what to do next. Maybe it was a mental thing. He focused really hard on thinking about just the chopstick on the left, trying his best to pretend that the chopstick on the right didn't exist. Git add chopstick. Still nope. He touched the chopstick that he'd moved. Git add chopstick. This worked. The virtual chopstick's position updated to the location of the real chopstick. Touching the chopstick made it unambiguous which chopstick he was referring to. The problem was he didn't want to have to touch it every time. He wanted to be able to use commands on the chopstick remotely, just like how it worked when there weren't multiple objects with the same name. Wait, he was being dumb. His quirk literally gave him the answer. He shifted the chopstick again. Git add chopstick F3, ack. Ack. His tongue twisted when he pronounced the square bracket. Oh wow, that was weird. He thought he'd gotten used to the weird way he spoke when issuing commands, but that was something else. There was no such thing as pronouncing a square bracket, yet his tongue moved through some eldritch plane so that it could do it anyway. Putting that aside, it looked like the command had worked, which was interesting considering that he didn't get the chance to speak the full code. The code for the first chopstick started with an F, while the code for the second started with an 8. He tried again. Git add chopstick F. And that worked. Apparently, he only needed to speak the minimum amount in order to distinguish the objects. If he unadded one of them, presumably he wouldn't need to use the codes. Git restore, staged chopstick 8. That should remove the second chopstick from his quirk. Git add chopstick. It was back to normal. Well, it was good that it worked, but it was kind of annoying that he'd have to memorize random codes whenever he added multiples of the same item to his quirk. Maybe there was a way for him to rename objects. The names that his quirk came up with seemed pretty arbitrary, after all. He should figure out how to do that at some point. Another thing to look into later, Izuku thought as he dutifully added a new item to the bottom of his checklist. He then wrote down the results of his test and checked off the first item on his to-do list. 1 down. Izuku chuckled when he realized that he'd checked off one item and also added one item. Numerically, he'd made no progress. This was going to take a while, which was fine by him. Next up, hollow square with rounded corners, 2 objects existing in the same spot. He moved the chopstick off to the side, leaving behind a virtual chopstick. Waving a hand through it, he confirmed once again that the transparent objects were completely intangible. So what would happen if he restored the original object while his hand was still inside the virtual chopstick? Well, he wouldn't actually test this with his hands, obviously. He needed to use something he didn't care about. Thus, he placed his math textbook on top of the virtual chopstick so that the chopstick was completely contained within the book. Git restore chopstick. Interesting error message. Something to look into, for sure. Izuku's eyes were drawn toward the instruction manual. Should he do it now? No, he shouldn't get distracted. He was trying to be more methodical today after all. Technically, he got an answer to his question. It didn't work. The error message suggested that there was a way to make it work, but that counted as a new investigation. Satisfied with that logic, Izuku checked it off the list and added his new question as an item to the bottom of the list. Next. Hollow square with rounded corners, multiple commands at once. Git add chopstick. Git add all might pencil. Git add salt shaker. That worked. With a pleased hum, he checked another item off his list. Some of them were simple, at least. Hollow square with rounded corners, what are saved locations relative to? This was one of those questions he thought of in the middle of the night while he trying to sleep. The intangibility of the virtual objects at first implied that no forces could affect them. They were static, fixed points in space. But that was obviously wrong because the Earth spins at some crazy speed, and then it also orbits the Sun, and then the Sun orbits something else, yada yada. Furthermore, the theory of relativity stated that there was no such thing as objective motion in the first place, only relative motion. It was in the name, relativity. So what were the virtual objects relative to? It could be the Earth, but it didn't sound right to him based on how the reference manual described Git. The technical details went way over his head, but it seemed like file hunks were located based on their relative position to nearby hunks, not based on any sort of objective global positioning system or whatever. If that were the case, shouldn't his quirk work similarly? He placed the chopstick on top of his math textbook. Git add chopstick. Then he moved both the book and the chopstick off to the side. Left behind was a virtual chopstick floating in midair, resting on top of a book that didn't exist. Izuku waved his hand through it. Yep, static and intangible. Git restore chopstick. The chopstick teleported back into position and clinked down onto the table, affected by gravity once again. Izuku moved the textbook and chopstick back into position, the latter atop the former. Git add math _ textbook, git add chopstick. Once again, he moved the book and the chopstick off to the side. Oh, he picked up the book. There was a virtual book on the table, as expected, but no virtual chopstick on top of it. Rather, the virtual chopstick seemed to be attached to the physical book. As he moved his textbook around, the virtual chopstick attached to the cover moved around with it. Now that was interesting, and surprising. He honestly didn't expect that to work. Okay, what was happening here, exactly? If he added an object normally, then the staged object would be locked in place relative to, well, the Earth's position, presumably. That's why the chopstick hovered in midair at first. But if he added an object that was touching another object that his quirk was also tracking, then the position of the virtual object was determined relative to that object. Hold on, this still didn't quite make sense. Izuku picked up the physical chopstick. The physical book was attached to the virtual chopstick, but not the other way around. There was nothing special about the physical chopstick, and the virtual book was still statically locked in place on the table. Was it based on the order in which he added the items? Once again, he placed the chopstick on top of the book. Git add chopstick, git add math _ textbook. He picked up the chopstick, and this time the virtual book came along with it. Neat. Moving the physical book aside, he could see the virtual chopstick was hovering in midair, like before. So it worked like a chain, or a layered cake, or something. He wasn't good with metaphors. The first item would always be relative to the Earth, the second item would be relative to the first item, and so on and so forth. Izuku waved the chopstick around in the air, watching the textbook move along with it. It was like they were glued together, except that of course the textbook weighed nothing. It was just the holographic image of a textbook after all. What would happen if he restored the textbook while it was moving? Flicking the chopstick side to side, Izuku said, "Git restore math _ textbook." The textbook flew off to the side at a surprisingly fast speed and landed in a crumpled heap on the floor. Oh. The restored physical object kept the momentum of the virtual object, even though the virtual object was weightless and intangible and so could effortlessly be moved at any speed at all. Holy shit! Izuku jumped up and down in excitement. He had to try this. He had to try this now. Maybe not with his math textbook though. Izuku scrambled to his bedroom and dug through his closet, soon enough finding a baseball. He came back out to the living room and picked up a chopstick, holding it vertically while his other hand positioned the baseball so that it rested on the top tip of the chopstick. Git add chopstick, git add baseball. With that done, he placed the baseball on the table. The physical chopstick in his hand now had a virtual baseball attached to its tip. All right. So he had to swing the chopstick and restore the baseball with precisely the right timing, like he was flicking a wand and casting a spell in those wizard movies. Izuku faced toward the couch. Focus, aim, he swung his arm. Git restore baseball, forward. The baseball bounced off the floor and crashed into the lamp next to the couch, knocking it onto the floor. Oh, whoops. Izuku rushed to inspect the lamp. Thankfully, the bulb wasn't broken. Izuku put the lamp back in its proper position, adjusted the lampshade so that it was resting properly, and flicked the light on and off a couple of times to make sure it was fine. Yeah, good as new. Mom would never have to know. Okay, so maybe he shouldn't be testing this indoors. It was as good of an excuse as any to get back to his notebook. He could easily get caught up in practicing the timing for the rest of the day otherwise. He'd discovered yet another aspect of his quirk that was a rabbit hole unto itself. His quirk had so many rabbit holes that it was becoming a rabbit warren. But he had to be disciplined. Izuku sat back down at the table, spent the next 10 minutes or so writing down what he'd learned and a bunch of ideas to try, added a half-dozen new entries to the bottom of his checklist, then finally checked off the original task. After a moment's thought, he added a big smiley face next to the checked-off task. This one had been way more rewarding than he expected it to be. Anyway, next. Hollow square with rounded corners include commit description in the same command. Right, this, the blank whiteness thing when he made commits was a bit annoying. He pulled over the reference manual and flipped to the page on Git Commit. After reading through the available options, he decided to try out the M flag, since it was short for message. Git commit M, testing to see if I can include the message within the commit command itself. Izuku felt unreasonably relieved that the log was in reverse chronological order, most recent commit first. That meant that once he made enough commits, his original commit would eventually be pushed off the first page and he would never have to see it again. However, what was important to note here was the branches. He was still on the normal pencil branch from yesterday, which it made sense since he had never switched back to the main branch. He didn't want to be stuck on normal pencil forever, though, so he needed to update the main branch. Also, the most recent commit on the main branch was his first commit, and that needed to be fixed. Desperately. Git switch main. He was now on the main branch, and nothing seemed to be any different. All the stuff on the table in front of him sat there untouched. Izuku hadn't been exactly sure what would happen when he switched branches, but he expected something to change. What would happen if he tried adding stuff or making commits in this branch? Git add baseball, he said. Oh, all right, he thought, let's think about this. Why isn't it working now? He touched the baseball and tried again. Git add baseball. And it was back to normal. The baseball is acting as if I haven't added it to my Quirk before, so I had to touch it first for commands to work. I'm on the main branch now, but all day I've been on the normal pencil branch. So now that I've gone back in time to the main branch, my Quirk is no longer tracking the baseball because it wasn't tracking at this point in the commit history. Izuku nodded to himself. Yep, that seemed like a reasonable explanation. He went to record his new observation in his notebook. Now, where had his pencil disappeared to? Oh, duh, of course. Izuku facepalmed and laughed to himself. That's what changed when he switched to the main branch. Obviously. Izuku went to his room and picked up the All Might pencil that was resting on his desk in exactly the same spot that it had been committed yesterday. He was starting to realize just how much of a logistical nightmare it was going to be to keep track of all of this stuff. He had made a few commits and added a handful of household items to his Quirk, and he was already losing track of things. He'd wanted a powerful Quirk, and he certainly had one, but who boy. That was a problem for future Izuku to solve, though. Present Izuku flipped through the reference manual again. If he wanted to update the main branch so that it included the object tracking and commits from the normal pencil branch, then he was pretty sure the correct command was git merge. As the name implied, this merged the history of the two branches. The part that made Izuku wary was the references to merge conflicts. This was when two file histories contradicted each other, so it ended up as a garbled-up mishmash of text that you had to sort out manually. Izuku didn't know how merge conflicts would manifest when applied to the real world. Frankly, he didn't think that he was ready for it yet. Izuku felt like he barely understood how his Quirk functioned. He'd had his Quirk for less than a day, after all. He ought to get more experience with it before he accidentally fused two objects together or something and couldn't fix it. All that being said, was it even relevant? Would any conflicts occur in the first place? Izuku pondered this. Think of it like a time travel movie. A merge conflict is like a time paradox. Something in the past has to be contradictory with something in the future in a way that can't be reconciled, like if I broke a pencil in the past, but it was still intact in the future. Izuku fiddled with the pencil in his hands. But that can't be the case right now. The only thing I changed on the main branch, in the past, was the location of this pencil. Everything else has been done in the future. I'm on the main branch right now, and I still haven't touched anything other than this pencil, so there are no contradictions here. It's a fully linear timeline. It doesn't make sense otherwise. There's no reason that the merge should fail. Izuku went over the logic a few more times in his head and eventually nodded in satisfaction. He was confident about this. It would definitely work. Izuku bonked his head against the table. Right, he forgot he added the baseball. Git restore. Staged baseball, Izuku said. Git merge normal pencil. He felt relief when he saw the text, fast forward. He actually understood his quirk enough to predict what it was going to do in advance. It was just as he said. The relationship between the two branches was a linear timeline from past to future, so merging the branches just meant that the past branch was fast-forwarded to be in sync with the future branch. He felt giddy. He was getting the hang of this. Check. Next. Izuku's stomach rumbled. Fine. Lunchtime first. Izuku continued in this vein for many hours. Every new test came with it dozens of new questions, all dutifully recorded in his notebook. Wow, this is getting to be almost full, Izuku marveled, flipping through his notebook. I can't believe I've written this much just today. All right, what's next on the list? He tapped his pencil against the next item. Hollow square with rounded corners wildcard characters. This was another thing that he'd read about in the manual. An example of a wildcard character was an asterisk star asterisk. Within Git, a star represented any letter and also any number of any letter. For example, the word fruit was just that. But fruit was different. The star represented a missing prefix. So, fruit might mean grapefruit or kiwi fruit, but it would not mean fruitcake because the star was on the wrong side. Both Izuku's math and science textbooks lay on the table in front of him, conveniently both names that ended with textbook, git add math _ textbook, git add science _ textbook. The two were added to his quirk, as usual. That was the slow way. Now for the wild way. Git add textbook. The command worked. Next, Izuku shoved both textbooks off the table. The science textbook opened up midfall and squashed its pages under its own weight upon landing. But that didn't matter because git restore textbook. Both textbooks teleported back on top of the table, undisturbed. Nice. This technique wasn't particularly useful at the moment, but it opened up a world of possibilities when he figured out how to rename objects. That would allow him to create collections of objects that he could manipulate as a group. Say that he set up a bunch of traps in a hideout and renamed all of them to have the prefix trap. Then later he could say, git restore trap, and let all of them loose on every villain in the hideout at once. He added the idea to his notebook. If a star represented any number of any character, then what would happen if he just used it by itself? Git restore asterisk. Minor mayhem occurred around Izuku as everything he'd added today returned to its last staged location. His pencil vanished from his hand. Everything on the table in front of him rearranged itself, and the cheesecake from the previous evening reappeared in the center of it all. A chopstick and baseball appeared together in the middle of the living room, hovering in the air for an instant before tumbling to the carpet below. Izuku giggled. This was fun. Anyway, on to the next item. Now where was his notebook? Where was his notebook? Izuku's heart plummeted into his stomach. Where was his notebook? Where was it? It couldn't be. No. Feeling like a zombie, Izuku got up from his seat. No. He walked slowly toward his bedroom. No. He opened the door, and the notebook was there, resting on his desk. No. He picked it up and flipped through it. The pages were blank. The notebook was pristine, brand new. No. How did this happen? It makes no sense. I haven't used my quirk on my notebook at all. This is bullshit. He thought back as hard as he could about everything that had happened so far. Wait, yesterday, when he first tested branches. Normal pencil 7B32E17, a normal, unbroken pencil. 2 files changed. Create mode 100,644 analysis _ notebook 84E96B7. That was it, wasn't it? He committed it right then, while it was blank. He committed it, not just added it, which meant that there was no virtual notebook, visible that would indicate to him that his notebook was in a temporary state. But, when he switched to the main branch earlier, his pencil teleported back to his room because that's when it was committed on that branch. Shouldn't the notebook have done the same? Or shouldn't there have been a, "Your local changes will be overridden," warning when he merged? Because there sure as hell were a lot of changes made to that notebook. Izuku pinched his brow. No, he had it wrong. The notebook was only added to the normal pencil branch. When he switched branches, the notebook became untracked because the main branch took place in the past compared to the normal pencil branch. It wouldn't have been affected by anything. He merged the branches, so the notebook was fast-forwarded through being tracked, then committed as an empty notebook, and then everything since then had been unstaged changes. It made sense. He hated to admit it, but it made sense. Izuku slumped onto the floor and held his head in his hands. It was all gone. It was really all gone. And it was his fault. You moron. You stupid Deku. He'd spent all day on it. He'd tried so hard. It was almost entirely full. He'd drawn diagrams and everything. So many pages, so many notes, so many ideas, so much work, all wasted. Fuck. Izuku felt tears coming to his eyes. He was too dumb for this Quirk. Chapter text. Only 15 push-ups left. Come on, you can do this. Izuku thought, trying to act as his own personal cheer squad. His arms were shaking from exertion. You're almost there. 4, 3, 2, 1. Done. Izuku groaned and sat back, rubbing his pained arms. Push-ups were saved for last, so he was done now. Izuku hated getting up early to do these workouts before school, but the alternative was worse. He didn't have the time to both do a workout and go for a run back-to-back, so one of them had to happen before school and the other after. He originally had it the other way around, going for a morning run before school, but having a full day at school, then working out, then homework was just too miserable. He liked running, so that helped to break it up. Man, it was already a school day. The weekend flew by way too fast for Izuku's taste. If only he had just a little bit more time. Like, a month, at least. A month-long weekend would be nice. Izuku started his cool-down stretches. On the bright side, I can show my quirk to everyone at school. They'll see that all along I was telling the truth. Admittedly, he'd stopped caring about what his classmates thought a long time ago. Being able to prove them all wrong was nice, but it wasn't as cathartic as he once thought it would be. Now that he had an awesome quirk and knew for sure that he would go to a hero school, hopefully UA, and become a hero, the approval of his classmates seemed so much more inconsequential. Izuku was going to get into a hero school, he had no doubts about that. Getting into UA specifically would be harder. They wanted the best of the best after all, and they only accepted around 35 new hero students per year. Was Izuku among the top 35 best kids his age in the whole country? The odds weren't in his favor. But getting into a hero school, one of the lesser ones, he could be a fat slob when he showed up to the entrance exam and he'd still probably get in once he showed the examiners his quirk. It was just too bonkers and versatile and dangerous to ignore. Just one touch and anything and anyone was permanently at the mercy of his crazy reality-warping quirk. Is this privilege? Is this what Kachan feels like all the time? Izuku finished his stretches. Walking over to his desk, he picked up his half-full analysis notebook. He'd intended to rewrite it yesterday, and he'd started to, but then he got distracted by wanting to try out new things, so it was instead a mishmash of some stuff he remembered from 2 days ago and a whole bunch of new things he'd thought of. My backpack is tracked by my quirk, and I've previously staged it, so it should act as the anchor point for any objects that I stage while they're touching the backpack, Izuku thought. He considered his logic a second time, nodded to himself, and placed his notebook inside his backpack. Git add analysis_notebook, git commit m, Monday morning backup. Satisfied, Izuku exited his room. He was gross and sweaty and it was time for a shower. The classroom bustled with adolescents and chatter. Class hadn't started yet, so friends bunched up into groups, hanging over each other's desks as they talked about their weekend, joked around, and other aimless gossip. Izuku sat at his desk alone because he didn't have any friends. For once, he didn't mind. Smiling brightly, Izuku hummed to himself with a pen in his hand and his analysis notebook wide open and vulnerable in front of him. He was rapidly doodling and jotting down notes inside, ones he wouldn't care about losing, looking for all the world like what he was writing was the most exciting and important thing ever. Oi, Deku, Katsuki stomped over to his desk. What the air you smiling about, huh? It was amazing how predictable Kachan was. He legitimately took it as a personal insult that Izuku was smiling. Maybe it was a blow to his pride, like, how dare you be happy after all the years of effort I've spent making sure you're not. Izuku turned to face his former friend. Kachan, I figured out my quirk, he exclaimed brightly and loudly. The din of the classroom noticeably became quieter after that proclamation. Several students started listening in. Izuku could imagine their thoughts. Wait, he's serious. The quirkless liar actually has a quirk. Katsuki's face bunched up in disbelief and anger. You don't have a quirk. You've never had a quirk. Show me. Izuku sighed theatrically. Oh, no, I couldn't do that. Quirk use is prohibited in the classroom, after all. I would never break such a sacred rule. Bullshit. You are a liar. God, it never ends with you. So instead, Izuku continued as if Katsuki hadn't spoken, I'm writing down all the ways I'll use my quirk when I become a pro hero. Look at how much I've written so far. He flipped through the notebook to show off the pages and pages of densely written notes. You'll never be a hero, Deku. You're never going to be anything but scum that I scrape off my feet. Katsuki was yelling loud enough that everyone in class was watching now. Agree to disagree. Izuku turned away and started writing stuff in his notebook again, seeming to ignore the loud blonde beside him. Thrusting his hand forward, Katsuki tore the notebook right from Izuku's grip. Quirks aren't allowed in class, yeah, he snarled menacingly, holding Izuku's notebook up for all to see. Bullshit. With that, a firecracker went off in Katsuki's hands. Everyone watched as Izuku's notebook went up in flames, Katsuki grinning all the while. After a few moments, the notebook was black, charred, and unusable. Git restore analysis _notebook. The destroyed notebook abruptly vanished from Katsuki's hands and reappeared on Izuku's desk, fully mended. Quiet gasps could be heard in the room. With a happy hum, Izuku got back to writing in the notebook as if the whole confrontation hadn't happened. Katsuki stared gobsmacked. All right, kids, settle down, the teacher said, strolling into the room. Class is starting now, please return to your seats. It took a few moments, but Katsuki eventually shuffled back to his desk. Izuku leaned back in his chair and smiled. That was totally worth it. The lunchroom bustled with adolescents and chatter. They were free from classes at the moment, so friends formed groups together around the lunch tables, stuffing their faces with food as they made plans for after school, goofed off, and other aimless leisure. Izuku sat at a table alone because he didn't have any friends. He didn't mind though. Well, he did a little, but Izuku definitely told himself that he didn't mind. Just because he had a quirk now didn't mean he was suddenly going to be popular. His classmates had had years to settle into friend groups, and it was far too late for Izuku's social status and reputation to suddenly flip. Really, it was a good thing. Truthfully, all he wanted to do right now was keep making quirk notes in his notebook. The morning classes were the longest continuous period of not using his quirk since he had gotten it, not counting sleep. He was itching to get back to work, so it was good he had this time to himself. Definitely. Small talk with classmates he barely knew would just be awkward. No thanks. Wait, someone's coming to my table. He thought eagerly. Hey, you're Deku, right? A boy he vaguely recognized as one of his underclassmen sat down in front of him. A part of Izuku was really tempted to reply. No, his name certainly was not Deku, but he didn't know this boy's name either, so it was likely that this was a genuine misunderstanding. I guess. My name's Midoriya Izuku. Yeah, cool. The boy didn't introduce himself in return. Hey, so, you just got a quirk that repairs things, right? The news had spread that quickly. Izuku didn't even know who this guy was. I guess that someone getting a quirk at our age is a hot topic for gossip. My quirk is a bit complicated, But yeah, that's one thing it can do. That's aces, yeah, so, it's not my fault, but this happened earlier. The boy pulled a phone with a smashed up screen out of his pocket and placed it on the table in front of Izuku. My mom's going to be real pissed if she sees this, so, fix it. It was easy to see how people had misunderstood his stunt earlier. Sorry, my quirk doesn't work that way. It's more like I can create save points. I've never seen your phone when it was intact, so I can't do anything here. Izuku picked up the phone and handed it back to the boy. Again, sorry. Oh, the boy scowled, then walked away without saying another word. Wow, rude. Izuku sat there and took a few bites of his lunch. When he got into UA, he'd change it. He'd change everything. No one at UA would have heard of the lying, quirkless Deku. No preconceptions, so he could be whoever he wanted. He'd put himself out there. He'd be the confident hero student Midoriya Izuku who was friendly, athletic, charming, and who could control time and space. He promised. He swore to himself. It would all change. It had to. He'd make it so. In the corner of his vision, he saw Katsuki enter the lunchroom. Damn it. Izuku quickly shoveled the rest of his lunch into his mouth, awkwardly chewing and swallowing slightly too large bites. Katsuki's gaze was scanning left and right across the room. Izuku tried to turn away, but he couldn't help but meet Katsuki's eyes. All right, we're doing this then. Izuku sighed as Katsuki stomped over to his table, grabbed him by the arm, and started dragging him out of the lunchroom. A couple of Katsuki's goons were with him as well, hanging back. It wasn't worth making a scene, so Izuku allowed it to happen. Actually being dragged would be humiliating though. It was better to pretend that they were equals and this was all mutually agreed upon. So Izuku made sure to keep pace with Katsuki as he was led out of the lunchroom. Katsuki continued to drag him into the hall, heading toward an exit door that led to a secluded spot behind the school. Gidad Bakugo_Katsuki, Izuku whispered, letting the loud bang of Katsuki slamming open the door muffle his words. Once outside, Izuku tore his arm out of Katsuki's grip and turned to face him directly. Two of Katsuki's minions loomed behind him, trying to look tough like they were in a gangster movie. They stared at each other for a moment, but Katsuki was never one for silence. Was it fun? He growled, making a fool out of me. Kinda, yeah, is destroying other people's property fun for you? He retorted. Hiding your quirk all this time? Katsuki shouted as if Izuku hadn't said anything. Were you looking down on me? You bastard, have you been laughing at me all these years? Going around all high and mighty, pretending you didn't have a quirk. What, Kachan, are you insane? Izuku yelled back, flabbergasted. What are you talking about? I never hid anything. You think I wanted to be known as a delusional quirkless kid? You think I wanted to have no friends since I was 5? No one gets a quirk this late. Even late bloomers only get their quirks a few years late. You had a quirk this whole time. Katsuki proclaimed this as if it were some grand revelation. Yes, I have. I'm not a late bloomer. I've always had a quirk. You know, like I've been saying for my entire life. Why did Izuku even need to defend this? Wasn't it all blatantly obvious? So, what, you've always had a quirk, but you were just too stupid and incompetent to use it till now. Katsuki said it mockingly as if the very concept was ridiculous. Izuku threw his hands up in the air. Yes, fine, I was too stupid to know how to use it until now. That's exactly what happened. If that'll get you off my back, I'm happy to admit it. Katsuki spat at the ground by Izuku's feet. Bullshit, you're a bastard, but you're not stupid. Once a liar, always a liar. But it doesn't matter because no matter what quirk you have, you'll never beat me. You're a pebble on the side of the damn road, and you need to learn to stay in your lane. Yeah, he'd heard all this before, thanks. He definitely needed to be reminded for the 10 millionth time about how much he is and how he'll never amount to anything. Don't look at me like that. Katsuki suddenly erupted. I'm better than you. Was Izuku making a face? He honestly couldn't tell. You think whatever lame quirk you've been hiding all this time can stack up against me? Katsuki let loose an explosion in his hands for emphasis. Git add Bakugo _ Katsuki. Izuku responded simply, updating Katsuki's staged location. You wanna fight? I'll kill you, he roared. Git commit M. Kachan is an asshole. Izuku was about to tell him about how Kachan is an asshole was now engraved into history for the rest of time, but then he realized just how much context he'd have to go into to explain why this was funny, and so the joke died on his tongue. Ing Dai. Katsuki launched forward, readying a right hook. Git restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. Katsuki vanished mid-lunge and reappeared in his original position. You wanna fight? I'll kill you, he roared. The two minions jolted backward in surprise, alarm on their faces. Oh, shoot, Izuku had completely forgotten they were even there. He was pretty sure Katsuki had, too. They had faded entirely into the background. Ing Dai. Katsuki launched forward again with another right hook. Git restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. Katsuki vanished and reappeared. You wanna fight? I'll kill you. Huh, this was the first time Izuku had used his quirk on a person. He didn't know that their memories were reset as well. It was obvious in retrospect, but in Izuku's head, he imagined Katsuki getting increasingly frustrated each time one of his attacks failed to connect. This wasn't as fun when Katsuki didn't know what was happening. Ing Dai. Git restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. You wanna fight? I'll kill you. This was getting nowhere. The goons were visibly starting to freak out too, seeing their leader seemingly stuck in a time loop. Izuku decided it was time to walk away. Where do you think you're going? Katsuki shouted, launching forward to grab Izuku by the shoulder. Git restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. You wanna fight? I'll kill. Huh, Katsuki stumbled. Izuku was walking away, no longer facing him. You can teleport. Bastard, you think that's gonna help you escape me? Ing Dai. Git restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. He opened the door that would lead him back inside the school. You wanna fight? I'll kill. Huh, Katsuki stumbled. This time, however, one of the goons grabbed him by the shoulder, stopping him from launching himself at Izuku again. Hey, Bakugo, maybe we shouldn't mess with him. The goon was sweating a bit, barely hiding his panic. What the? Are you scared of Deku? That little shit couldn't. The door slammed shut, cutting Izuku off from hearing the rest of Katsuki's rant. He sighed. Can lunchtime please be over already? The rest of the school day was tedious as always. In social studies, Izuku filled out a math worksheet assigned to them in the previous class, barely paying attention to Mr. Nakamura as he blandly regurgitated stuff Izuku already knew. UA only accepted the best of the best, and that applied to academics just as much as heroic potential. Other hero schools were fine with dumb brutes, but UA prided itself on nurturing intelligent, tactical leaders of the field. If Izuku was going to get into UA, he needed to prove that he was capable. So, was Aldera Junior High giving him a best of the best education that would help him outcompete the smartest, most driven students in the country? Ha ha ha, ha 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 ha. Students with wealthy families could hire private tutors to help them get an advantage, but Izuku couldn't afford that, obviously. Thankfully, if you were determined to learn, there were a lot of fantastic free resources out there that could do the job. There were many lectures online that went over the same content that school was teaching him, except shorter and explained far better. Thus, school nowadays was just a review of stuff Izuku had studied a long time ago. It was nice to double-check that he hadn't somehow missed any topics, and exams were a good way to confirm that he had successfully retained all the information he'd learned, but otherwise, he tried to use lecture time to finish as much homework as he could get away with so that he wouldn't have to do it later. The school day was almost over. Izuku started surreptitiously packing his books away. He'd have to escape quickly if he didn't want to be caught by Katsuki again. Midoriya. Bakugo. Please see me after class, Mr. Nakamura declared. Oh, you've got to be kidding me. The bell rang, and the rest of the students happily ambled out of the classroom, split between heading to after-school clubs and heading home for the day. Before long, only the three of them remained: Izuku, their teacher, and Katsuki, who was looking just as annoyed as Izuku. Now boys, I heard you two had a disagreement earlier today at lunch, Mr. Nakamura said. Specifically, Midoriya, I hear you used your quirk offensively to hurt Bakugo, one of your fellow classmates. What do you have to say for yourself? Deku didn't do jack shit. Do I look hurt? Katsuki exclaimed. How did you even hear? It was those two idiots, wasn't it? They snitched. It doesn't matter if neither of you are hurt, the intent is what matters, their teacher replied. Furthermore, I hear Midoriya only attacked you with his quirk due to your own aggressive behavior. As you know, at Aldera we have a zero-tolerance policy against both quirk usage and bullying. Izuku and Katsuki looked at each other in shared bafflement. Katsuki scrunched his face up as if to say, can you believe the shit that's coming out of this guy's mouth? Now, I've been an educator for many years. I know that emotions can run high among boys your age. However, I must make it clear that this behavior is not acceptable and will not be tolerated moving forward. You never, Katsuki began, but he cut himself off. It was obvious to Izuku what Katsuki was going to say, you never cared before. However, by saying it, he would implicitly be admitting that he was guilty of bullying and quirk usage and all of it. For whatever reason, the school cared about this now. It'd be dumb for Katsuki to call attention to it, and for all of his faults, he wasn't dumb. Katsuki was clearly confused as to what was going on, but the pieces were falling into place for Izuku. There was a Freudian slip in what his teacher had said, will not be tolerated moving forward. Implying that it had been tolerated up until now. Which, yeah, obviously that was the case. But the key insight here was that the teacher was aware of it too. Therefore, something had changed. What had changed was that some bullies had snitched to the teachers about Izuku's reality warping quirk. Probably acting all freaked out by it, worried that Izuku would use it on them too. The school administrators now knew that Izuku had a quirk powerful enough to scare a group of bullies. And Izuku had made no secret of his plans to get into UA and become a hero. The school didn't just have one golden child anymore. It now had two UA hopefuls with powerful quirks under its roof, and it was suddenly vitally important to prevent the two of them from killing each other before graduation. The two of you will be coming with me to the office for your detention, Mr. Nakamura continued. I hope that both of you take this time to reflect on your actions. The teacher led Izuku and Katsuki to the school office, where they were shown several boxes full of paperwork. They were instructed to file the paperwork in the filing cabinets, ordered by date, and that their detention would not end until the task was complete. Izuku took a look at the first page in his stack. It was some report from the Ministry of Education regarding budgets for various programs. The next page was a printout of an email correspondence between some people on the school board. Wait. Hold on, wasn't this all confidential information? Were students even allowed to see this, or was the teacher just pawning his own work on the two of them and pretending that it was for detention? Who was he kidding? He knew the answer to that question already. I hate this school. He and Katsuki worked quietly and efficiently, silently agreeing to shut up and try to get this over with as quickly as possible. There was a lot of work to do though, and the tedium of it all unfortunately gave Izuku a chance to think. Earlier today had been the first time he'd used his quirk on a human being, and the fact that his quirk reset the person's memories raised some very uncomfortable questions. It seemed fine at the time because Katsuki had only lost a few seconds of memories, but it wasn't limited to just that. After all, Izuku could say, "Git restore Bakugo Katsuki," right now, and Katsuki would immediately vanish and be replaced by a version of him who had never experienced the last several hours. So what happened to the Katsuki who vanished? Did that version of him just die? This all came back to the question of, what truly is a person? And all of the age-old philosophical quandaries that arose from thinking too deeply about it. The classic ship of Theseus thought experiment asked whether a ship was still the same ship even after all of its components had been replaced. You could apply the same concept to a human being. After some amount of time, every cell that made up a person would eventually be replaced, so was that person still the same person? To Izuku, the answer was obvious, yeah, of course, duh, and thus, the dilemma of the ship of Theseus was solved, it was still the same ship. Duh. If a person wasn't their body, then what was a person? An easy answer was, their mind, but that answer had its own drawbacks. If you killed a person, and then you grew a clone of them in a vat with exactly the same thoughts, feelings, and memories. Was that the same person? Clearly it wasn't, but why? You could try adding qualifiers like, it has to be one continuous uninterrupted consciousness, but that definition had its own hazy edge cases. When a doctor resuscitates a medically deceased patient, is the person who wakes up still the same person? Metaphysically speaking, was there any actual difference between that scenario and the scenario where the person was replaced by a clone? If you presuppose that there was a difference, did that establish that souls must exist? Throughout time, philosophers have pondered these questions, and many others like them, because they were interesting brain teasers that sparked lively debate and allowed everyone involved to feel smart. Unfortunately, Izuku was pondering them because he had no idea how his quirk worked and he was freaking out. Is that what Izuku had been doing to Katsuki? Killing him, then replacing him with a clone. And it wasn't like it was just limited to this one day, either. Years from now, when they were both pro-heroes and had repaired their relationship, maybe Izuku could one day say, "Get restore Bakugo Katsuki," and Katsuki would be killed and replaced with an angry 14-year-old version of himself. Sure, he could continuously commit Katsuki. Every day, perhaps, so that he would never lose more than a day's worth of memories. Perhaps that would be something he did as a hero in the future. Commit his teammates every day so that he could bring them back to full health if something ever went terribly wrong. But that wasn't what Izuku wanted to do now. He didn't want that responsibility, especially considering that he had accidentally deleted his notebook only 2 days ago. He wasn't ready for this. There was another solution though. His commands didn't work on objects before he added them for the first time. He needed his quirk to go back to treating Katsuki like that. The command to stop tracking an object was, "Get where was short for remove." It was the opposite of get add. He hadn't had a reason to use the command yet, but he remembered it clearly from the reference manual, and it was detailed in his notes. "Mr. Nakamura, sir, my quirk can actually continuously affect other people until I specifically remove it. Do I have permission to undo the hold my quirk has on Kachan?" Katsuki bristled. "Do you mean you're still using your quirk on me?" The teacher was lounging on a chair, busy texting someone. "Yes, of course. You should have done that a long time ago." "Right, yeah. Get Bakugo _ Katsuki." Katsuki abruptly stopped existing. The papers he was holding fell and scattered all over the floor. The office room was eerily still and silent. "What?" Izuku whispered. "What?" Mr. Nakamura rushed behind him and started shaking his shoulder. "What happened? What did you do?" I don't know. That wasn't supposed to happen. That wasn't supposed to happen." Both of them stared at the empty spot where Katsuki used to be. His quirk could delete things. Just gone, poof. His quirk could delete people. Oh God, he killed Kachan. Izuku's heart was racing, and he could feel himself start to hyperventilate. Oh God, wait, no, he needed to calm down. Breathe, Izuku. He could fix this, sort of. He'd made a commit of Kachan. Izuku's mouth was dry as he muttered, I know where Kachan is. Will be, this way. He didn't wait to see if his teacher would follow him. He raced downstairs, retreading the same path Katsuki had dragged him earlier, down the hall, through the exit door, out to the secluded spot behind the school. Mr. Nakamura had followed him. He wasn't far behind, just exiting the door. Izuku stared at the empty patch of ground in front of him. Get restore Bakugo _ Katsuki. Katsuki appeared out of thin air. You wanna fight? I'll kill. He stumbled to a stop. Izuku watched as Katsuki darted his eyes around this way and that, looking increasingly distraught. What must this look like from Kachan's point of view? A moment ago he was confronting Izuku at lunch, but now the sun was low in the sky, and Izuku, well, he didn't know what expression he was wearing right now, but he felt like a total wreck. The two goons had vanished, and their teacher was there instead, a look of grave concern on his face. Izuku stepped forward. Katsuki tensed up as if he were expecting an attack, but something about the situation must have changed his mind since he didn't immediately start swearing or back away. Izuku threw his arms around Kachan and cried. The sun was already setting by the time Izuku got home. He certainly wasn't going for a run today. It was too bad. He could have used the chance to clear his mind. His mom was already there when Izuku entered the apartment. She'd been waiting for him. Izuku, I got a call from your school today, Mom said, hands on her hips. Care to tell me why? Sweetie, oh sweetie. What happened, my baby? What's wrong? Did he look that bad? Maybe the tear marks were still visible on his cheeks. Hi, Mom. I'll tell you, I promise I'll tell you soon. But I really need to do something first. I'm sorry. I'll come out soon, just hold on. Without waiting for his mom to agree, Izuku rushed to his room and slammed the door. The Git reference manual sat innocently on Izuku's desk. He glared at it with betrayal in his eyes. The entire way home, only one thought had been in his mind, circling endlessly, digging into his skull. Why didn't it work? Why the hell did Git erase Katsuki? It was supposed to just untrack him. He wasn't crazy. The manual had a section where it listed example commands to accomplish various tasks, and that was one of them. Izuku sat down at his desk and flipped through the pages in fury. He knew what he read. He wasn't making this up. Did the manual just lie? What had gone wrong? He found the page he was looking for and read through it carefully. Squeezing his eyes shut, he slumped forward, his forehead hitting his desk with a thud. The correct command wasn't git some underscore object. It was git some underscore object, cached. Why, cached? Who in their right mind would ever make stop tracking this object, and delete this object from existence, the same command? And really, why cached? Even if you were crazy enough to make these two wildly different things the same command, why not give it a name that made sense, like untrack? What did cached even mean? Oh, and don't forget, there was a step 2 to this process. Because of course there was. Of course you couldn't just untrack the object and be done with it. No. Next you had to commit the fact that you had untracked it. Otherwise, the untracking could be undone like anything else. Not the other way around. Oh no. When he added something, it was tracked immediately. But untracking had to be committed. Only then would his Quirk be happy. Happiness is fleeting. Only commits are forever. Izuku squeezed his eyes shut and sighed. It was time for Quirk testing. He really wasn't in the mood, but it had to happen. He looked around his desk for something he wouldn't mind losing. Git ballpoint pen. That didn't work, which wasn't a surprise. His Quirk couldn't seem to affect anything unless he added it first. He picked up the pen. Git add ballpoint underscore pen. Now for the real test. Git ballpoint underscore pen. Error. The following file has changes staged in the index. Ballpoint underscore pen 3D672A3. That was mildly reassuring. Sort of. His insane, dangerous Quirk that could instantly delete things from existence had a safety feature. He couldn't delete things without committing them first. And, inherently, once something was committed, he could always return it to that state. There were still countless ways that Izuku could screw up and ruin everything, but he'd take what he could get. Next, Izuku grabbed his pencil and placed it in the center of his desk. Git all underscore might underscore pencil, cached. Izuku wasn't a fan of the wording his Quirk used. Apparently, his Quirk figured that if he wasn't tracking something, then it might as well not exist. It didn't matter. His Quirk claimed that it had deleted the pencil, but it was still there on the desk in front of him, so whatever. Now for the moment of truth. Git add all might pencil. Git restore all might pencil. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. It worked. Commands no longer worked on the pencil. It didn't undo anything that he'd previously done, of course. The commits he had already made of the pencil were still there, and they would always be there. He could recover those commits if he needed to, but he'd have to go out of his way to do so. Until he added the pencil again, it would no longer be affected by any normal commands. Izuku casually spoke aloud, which was the important part. There was one last thing to do. He couldn't delay. It would just get harder and harder the more he overthought it, and his mom wasn't going to wait for him forever. Izuku pulled out his phone, scrolled through his tiny number of contacts, and called Katsuki. "What the hell do you want, shitty nerd?" Katsuki answered instantly. He must have already been using his phone. I'm sorry, Kachan. I'm so sorry about earlier, you have no idea. You don't have to forgive me, I don't know how to make it up to you, I'm just sorry. But, I still need to remove you from my quirk, and I'm scared after last time, so just keep talking while I do this so that I know you're okay. What the? You're experimenting with your quirk on me over the phone. Yes, just like that, keep talking. Bakugo_Katsuki, cached. What the hell are you doing? Don't ignore me, you bastard. Good, that's good. Git commit untracked Kachan. Answer the ing question, Deku. Git add Bakugo Katsuki. Okay, thanks, bye. Don't you dare hang up on me you. Izuku hung up on him. Izuku leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling for a few minutes. Today ed. Chapter text. It was the day of the UA entrance exam. The last 10 months had been a whirlwind of training, quirk practice, physical conditioning, self-defense lessons, studying, quirk brainstorming, and so much else. Time had seemed to have passed agonizingly slowly while Izuku was in the middle of it, but now that the day had arrived it felt like it had happened way too fast. Was he really ready for this? Well, it didn't matter if he felt ready or not. He'd have to be. Izuku was up early in the morning. He'd already showered, brushed his teeth, had breakfast, and all the other daily morning rituals. He was in his room now making his final preparations for the day ahead. Izuku's quirk, as amazing as it was fundamentally about preservation. He could save the state of objects and bring them back to how they were at previous points in time. That was incredibly useful in countless situations, but there was a key issue. Heroes were generally reactive, not proactive. Heroes were called in when things were already messed up, and it was the hero's job to fix it. This contradicted the basic premise of Izuku's quirk. Izuku was best at preserving things as they were, but that ran counter to his job as a hero. If he encountered some situation where a villain, or natural disaster, or whatever, had caused destruction, then preserving the destruction was the exact opposite of what he should do. He was similarly restricted when it came to combat. Sure, he could use his quirk on villains directly, but that required touch. His quirk didn't help him physically, he was still a normal squishy human. He needed ways to handle situations that didn't rely on him getting within striking distance of villains with powerful physical enhancement quirks who could knock his head off his shoulders. The UA entrance exam was a great demonstration of this dilemma. Izuku had no idea what the exam would entail. He was going in blind. Whatever happened, he'd have to improvise on the spot. It matched the kind of unpredictable environment he'd face as a real pro hero. If he was unlucky and his quirk couldn't help with the tasks they wanted him to perform, then he needed to prove he was capable even if he had to act effectively quirkless. With all that being said, even though the exotic time warping aspects of his quirk would be of limited use, Izuku still had a few tricks up his sleeve. He'd had months to prepare for this after all. Izuku put on the special vest, cargo pants, and socks that he'd prepared for this day. The vest and pants had tons of pockets, straps, and hooks that could be used to carry any number of items. Which was exactly the point. Get switch tool belt, Izuku commanded. Immediately, Izuku was bogged down with an exorbitant amount of equipment strapped to every piece of available surface area on his clothes. He was too encumbered to even move with a shield, a first aid kit, lots of rope, a baton, a metal baseball bat, a net, caltrops, a bola, handcuffs, a dagger, a slingshot, a helmet, a spray bottle filled with apple juice, a small axe, a flashlight, a thermal imaging camera, a lockpick set, and so much more, all weighing him down. It was a good thing then that he didn't need to carry any of it. He carefully removed all the equipment he was wearing and placed everything on the floor of his room. Left behind were dozens of virtual objects, weightless, intangible virtual objects, all anchored to his vest and cargo pants and easily summonable with a simple git restore. The vast majority of it wasn't going to be useful, but all that mattered was that something would be. Hopefully. He felt like he needed to explain the spray bottle filled with apple juice, part. He emailed UA to tell them that his quirk allowed him to summon objects from home, and he asked what he was allowed to summon. They said it was fine so long as he provided a list for their approval. His original list included pepper spray, but they asked him not to bring real pepper spray. However, for the purposes of the exam, they'd honor substitutes. Should the exam involve fighting mock villains, then the actors would be instructed to treat the apple juice like pepper spray. He was as ready as he was ever going to be. Izuku went downstairs to see his mom waiting by the door. After putting on his shoes and jacket, Mom gave him a big hug. "Knock 'em dead, sweetie. I'm so proud of you, no matter what happens. I love you, Izuku." He hugged her back. "Love you too, Mom." Nothing more needed to be said. Izuku gazed up at UA in wonderment. It was so big. That sounded stupid to say, but Izuku was never great at poetic descriptions. The school grounds were crowded with seemingly thousands of students. Sure, not all of them were here for the hero course exam, but it was still intimating for Izuku to see just how many hero hopefuls he was up against. Out of this massive crowd, only 30 to 40 of them would actually be accepted into heroics. If Izuku did well today, he would be one of them. He took a determined step forward, a step toward his destiny. "Out of my way, Deku." Katsuki had come up right from behind him and shoulder-checked him to the side. Izuku stumbled and had to stop himself from falling over. What an asshole. Two could play at that game. "Out of my way, Kachan," he shouted, running up to Katsuki and shoulder-checking him in return. Katsuki must not have expected Izuku to retaliate because he wasn't ready to catch himself. He stumbled to the side, his foot catching on a slightly raised piece of the walkway. He pitched forward and was about to face plant into the ground. A girl slapped Katsuki's shoulder and he started floating in midair. "Release." The girl called once Katsuki was upright. "Are you all right? Sorry for using my quirk without asking first. But it'd be bad luck if you fell, right?" Katsuki stared at the girl for a moment, and then he raged. "I don't need luck. I'm going to be the greatest hero ever. Who do you think you are? I don't need your help. I don't need anyone's help. Stay out of my business." The girl stood there shell-shocked as Katsuki turned away and stomped his way into the school, scowling all the while. Izuku held his face in his hands. "Classic Kachan. Please, please don't be in my class." The girl was still standing there. Wait, this was a chance for Izuku to practice being the new him. The cool hero student. He walked over to her. "Hi," he said, grabbing her attention. I saw the whole thing. Just letting you know, that guy you were talking to, Bakugo Katsuki, I've known him for pretty much my entire life. Kachan is like that with everyone. It's not just you. Your quirk is really cool." The girl faced him. She was just a little bit shorter than him, with big eyes and a brown-haired bob cut. "Oh, thank you. I'm Uraraka Ochako. So, is he your friend?" He hadn't introduced himself. He introduced Kachan before introducing himself. Stupid Deku. "I'm Midoriya Izuku, and, no, he isn't." Uraraka looked embarrassed. "Right, got it, sorry. Come on, stop making this awkward. I'm supposed to be playing the part of the confident, charming hero student. Man, I need more practice at this." "Yeah, so, I wanted to say something because you didn't deserve that at all. That was really nice of you, you just kinda got unlucky. Anyone else would have appreciated the help, but for Kachan specifically, next time, just let him fall." Uraraka snorted. "It was pretty cute. Don't worry, if he doesn't want help, I'm not going to help him again. Ever." Izuku tried to remember what the guides online said about how to make people like you. Flattery was a big one, especially if you pointed out specific things that a person did. It demonstrated that you were paying attention to them. "You have amazing reflexes." Kachan was barely falling, and then you were already there swooping in to save the day. "You were really cool. Are you here to take the hero exam too?" Uraraka blushed and smiled at that. Score. "Yeah, you too. I'm pretty nervous, but I figure we all are. Let's do our best." "Definitely. I hope to see you in class." "Right back at ya." Uraraka held her fist out for a fist bump, which Izuku happily returned. The two of them waved goodbye to each other and started heading toward their respective exam rooms. The written exam was before the practical exam, and each student had an assigned classroom and seat. Izuku was in a good mood. See, he could make friends. His social skills hadn't completely atrophied over the years. It was time to begin the exam. Hopefully he could keep this positivity going. Izuku felt he did okay on the written exam. Since he had deliberately studied beyond his grade level, Izuku recognized how the exam was structured. The first half was a tougher version of the same kind of standardized exam that he'd soon take to graduate from Aldera. This was what students their age were expected to know if they'd been keeping up with their studies. Izuku was confident that he'd aced this section. The second half ramped things up quickly. Izuku was fine for the first page because it covered topics he had learned during his self-study. But every time Izuku flipped to the next page, the exam seemed to jump another grade level, and it didn't take long for Izuku to go from being confident, to being cautious, to being worried, to just guessing and praying. Most of the questions were multiple choice, so maybe Izuku would get lucky. Unfortunately, the math section required you to show your work and not just select your answer. He had to give up on that section entirely once it started introducing weird symbols like, for all X in S. But Izuku had to remind himself that he had studied beyond his grade level. He objectively knew more than students his age were expected to know. UA may have gone plus ultra with their written exam, as they did with everything, but it wasn't reasonable for a high school to demand its students to have mastered the entire high school curriculum before even getting into high school. The exam was probably just designed to give a chance for the geniuses to show off. His mood was buoyed by the final question of the exam, an essay question, and by far the easiest of them all. Why do you want to be a pro hero? Izuku had known his answer to this question for nearly his entire life. He had self-reflected many times over the years, and it always came back to one simple truth. Helping people makes me happy. There were additional factors, of course. If he just wanted to help people, why not become a doctor, or a charity worker, or any of the other ways a person could help others? Truthfully, it all came back to the video of All Might's debut. That was when he knew he wanted to be a hero, and that feeling had never changed. On that day, disaster struck. Unsuspecting people were suddenly faced with the worst day of their lives, crushed under the weight of terror and torment, engulfed by a chasm of pitch-black despair. And then, the sight of a hero coming to save them was enough to drive away that darkness, bringing in light and hope. That's what Izuku wanted. He wanted to be there. He wanted to see it. He wanted to feel it. And yes, he wanted to be responsible for it. Izuku wanted to be one of the people bringing light and hope. Helping people in that context was what made him feel the most happy. He could be a charity worker instead and know, in the abstract, that his work helped a lot of people, but that's not what he most wanted. Was that selfish? Was it wrong that he wanted instant gratification? Izuku didn't think so. There was nothing wrong with wanting to devote your life to something that made you happy. Furthermore, from a purely practical perspective, heroics was visible and heavily marketed. In his essay, Izuku cited several examples of donations to an engagement with charitable organizations going up by thousands of % just by All Might promoting them once. He could spend his whole life helping others, but that was dwarfed by the impact he would have if he inspired just a handful of people to spend their lives helping others. Izuku finished his essay, reviewed his answers, then closed the booklet and put down his pencil. It looked like about half the students were still working. One test down. One to go. Izuku made his way to the auditorium where they would be prepped for the physical exam. Looking for his seat, he was once again astounded by how many other students were here and how many amazing quirks he could see. He had his work cut out for him if he was going to prevail over them all and earn his spot. He found his seat, and, oh, it was next to Kachan. Right, their school would have sent in their applications at the same time, so the two of them had successive applicant numbers. Katsuki glared at him when he sat down, but thankfully didn't try to start anything. A few minutes passed as everyone found their seats. When everyone was settled, Present Mike unexpectedly leapt out from behind the stage and made a cool pose. It's Present Mike. Izuku barely stopped himself from squealing. He listened to his radio show every week. Present Mike was here, in Ua. If Izuku got in, Present Mike would be one of his teachers. He could talk to him about his show in person. The reality of it all was settling in. This is what his life could be like every day if he passed this exam. He was so excited. Present Mike sashayed up to the podium. For all you examinee listeners tuning in, welcome to my show today. Everybody say, yeah, quote. The excitement was unbearable. Yeah, Izuku cheered, so happy to be here, so close to his dream. His cheer echoed around the silent auditorium. The students in front of him turned and looked at him strangely. He was the only one. Izuku shrunk into his seat and tried to hide his face. It felt like he had swallowed a rock, and he was burning up all over. Next to him, Katsuki was nearly biting his arm off, trying to stop himself from laughing hysterically. Just put him out of his misery already. He could dig a nice hole and live there for the rest of his life. Tour guides could make a spectacle of the native hole-dwelling Deku, and then everyone would point and laugh. That was all he was good for. Yeah, Izuku's head jerked up. That voice. Wait, was that really? He looked to where the cheer had come from, and halfway across the room, he saw a familiar brown-haired girl with a bob cut. Uraraka met his eyes and grinned cheekily. Izuku almost cried there and then. Yeah, another person. Who was that? Izuku looked, and it was some boy with spiky red hair. Izuku didn't know him. Why did he cheer? Did he just not want to be left out? After that third cheer, silence settled over the auditorium. No one else spoke up. Present Mike leaned back in a casual pose. It sounds like only 3 people want to be here, he announced in an impish tone. Where's that enthusiasm? Where's that plus ultra spirit? You're all here because you want to be paragons of virtue and justice for the country, and as far as I can tell only 3 of you have a good attitude. Maybe they deserve bonus marks. Let's try that again. Everybody say, yeah, quote. Yeah, boomed the students. Izuku looked over and was delighted to see that even Katsuki joined in, although he looked like he was biting a while doing so. That's more like it. Now, let me give you all the rundown on the practical exam. Izuku followed his exam group to Battle Center 2 at Ground Delta. The idea that a high school could afford an entire fake city on school grounds was crazy. The idea that a high school could afford multiple fake cities was completely outrageous. Ua is awesome, Izuku thought gleefully. The school grounds were big enough that his group needed to take a bus ride to the exam location. Izuku was very thankful for the bus ride because during that time he came up with a plan. Not a foolproof plan, but he was pretty happy with it. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He was going to rock this exam. Hopefully, his group all bunched together near the giant entrance gates to Ground Delta. The test would be starting soon. Izuku saw the different ways that people prepared themselves. Some students were lightly stretching, looking totally relaxed. Izuku envied them. Others were clearly nervous, some frozen in place while others paced back and forth. Some of the more socially brave ones started up strained small talk with each other, mostly a bunch of terse variations on, feeling ready. And, good luck. Izuku himself was wondering if he should risk saying some commands now before the exam officially started, or if that would count as cheating. The gates suddenly opened with a bang. Go! Present Mike yelled from somewhere. Huh! Everyone looked at each other in confusion, conversations halted and stretches frozen in place. Now. There are no countdowns in real life. Go! Oh, okay, then. Izuku jumped in the air and called, "Get cherry-pick rollerblades, no commit." He landed wearing a pair of rollerblades, having swapped locations with his shoes. The streets of the fake city were pretty much all smooth cement, which was perfect for him. He quickly skated his way into the exam zone. There were some other students with mobility quirks who were ahead of him, such as a boy with engines in his legs, but Izuku had a great head start compared to most of his competitors. Next, he needed a weapon. "Get restore baseball_bat, Izuku shouted. A metal baseball bat materialized into existence strapped to his hip like a sword. He grabbed the bat and held it out proudly. "Oh yeah, Izuku was a real teen delinquent now, charging around a city on rollerblades while wielding a baseball bat. Now all he needed was a spray can so he could graffiti up the place. Izuku came across his first one-pointer robot. It was an army green mech with a one-wheel design. It had riot shields for arms and guns for its hands, and it was quite a bit larger than Izuku himself. He started to feel a bit nervous. It was much bigger than it looked like in the presentation slides. The baseball bat might not cut it. While large and dangerous, the one-wheel design wasn't great for close-quarters maneuverability. Izuku zoomed past and tagged the robot. Git add _pointer_robot. He added the robot in preparation for the next step of his plan, but before that, he needed a quick and reliable way of destroying them. The one-pointer had trouble turning around, so Izuku zipped behind it where it had fewer defenses and bashed the back of its head in with the baseball bat. Unfortunately, one swing wasn't enough. It started to turn and point its gun hands at him. Izuku had to bash its head in a second time before the robot stopped moving. From his angle behind the robot, Izuku could see colorful exposed wires running up to the robot's head. Pulling out those wires was probably how students with less combative quirks could defeat the robots. That could be faster than using his baseball bat. Izuku would keep the option in mind, but he had another idea that he'd try first on the next villain bot. "Since when can you bring weapons?" someone shouted at him. Izuku turned to see a boy run up next to him, some purple-haired kid. "Since always," he replied. "You just need to get them approved first." He could see the soul leave the purple-haired boy's body. "Yeah, tough luck, bud." Izuku didn't blame him. UA's website said, "You are not required to bring anything with you to the exam," which was a very sneaky way of saying absolutely nothing at all. Izuku figured it was probably designed to reward students who thought outside the box and engaged with a trivial degree of intelligence gathering, i.e. sending an email and asking. Anyway, Izuku couldn't get distracted by the kid having a mental breakdown next to him. It was time to execute the next stage of his plan. Git grep _pointer_robot, untracked. The command worked. Izuku grinned in triumph. Another explanation was in order. The grep command could be used to search the contents of all files across all commits in a repository. Izuku had no what grep was supposed to mean. It obviously meant find, but some lunatic decided to call it grep. Regardless, he could use the command to find an object that he had previously added to his quirk. By appending the untracked flag, he could also use it to find all objects similar to it within a certain distance radius. Thankfully, that distance was measured in kilometers, so it covered the entire exam arena. Izuku now knew the locations of every one-pointer robot in the city. Izuku found it difficult to describe what he was seeing. It wasn't seeing at all. It was as if all one-pointer robots in the city now had bright red outlines around them, except that it wasn't limited to his actual eyesight. It was a 360 sensation that ignored walls and any other obstructions. He just knew where they all were now. He could see them all, clear as day. From his experiments, he knew this would last for 5 minutes or until he used another grep command. The time limit was inconsequential because he could use the command again at any time to reset the timer. The actual issue was that grep commands overwrote each other. He knew the locations of every one-pointer robot, but not the two-pointer or three-pointer robots. Izuku had a plan for that too. He zoomed off in search of one of the other types of robots. Thanks to his rollerblades, he moved fast and quickly found a two-pointer. It was larger than the one-pointer, but also slower. Izuku zoomed past and quickly tagged it. Git add _pointer_robot. Tossing the baseball bat aside, Izuku said, "Git restore slingshot marbles." This summoned both his slingshot and a bag of multicolored marbles. Each of the marbles had different objects anchored to them. He armed himself with the slingshot and specifically plucked out the blue-colored marble. Facing the two-pointer, he pulled back and aimed carefully. With precise timing, he released and yelled, "Git restore bowl B." A bowling ball materialized at the location of the marble, moving at speeds as if it had been shot out of a cannon. It crashed into the two-pointer, nearly punching straight through its body. The robot collapsed, mangled and broken. It had stood absolutely no chance. Izuku excitedly pumped his fist in the air. He'd been worried about using this technique due to the potential of collateral damage, and because it was difficult to get the timing right, even with nearly a year of practice, but the villain bots were so large that it wasn't a concern at all. He wouldn't need to bother with the baseball bat. Oh right, he should also note that Bowl B was short for bowling ball. He'd learned how to rename objects, and getting the timing down was a lot easier with a one-syllable word. Get restore marbles blue, he said to return the marble to him. Get grep to _pointer_robot, untracked. Izuku now knew where all the two-pointer robots were, but at the expense of losing his knowledge of the one-pointers. He'd fix that soon, but there was still one type of robot to go. He didn't have to search for a three-pointer, it was right in the middle of the street in front of him. The three-pointer was basically a tank. He skated up to tag it, get add 3_pointer_robot, and he felt uncomfortable even getting that close. Izuku had no idea how UA expected most applicants to be able to deal with it. It was large, protected on all sides, with huge projectile launchers on its back, no obvious weak points. Get restore Bowl B, and equally vulnerable to being obliterated by a cannonball. Booyah! There was one last step in his plan. Currently, he could only grep one kind of robot at a time. That in itself was a huge advantage, but ideally, he wanted to be able to locate all three kinds simultaneously. And he knew exactly how to do that. This was a job for wildcards, baby. Get grep pointer_robot, untracked, Izuku commanded, and he suddenly knew the precise locations of every villain bot in the city. One might note that he'd previously had to use a star as a wildcard character, so you might expect that he meant to say *_pointer_robot, in order to match 1_point_robot, 2_pointer_robot, etc. There was a good reason why he didn't have to do that here, and usually he'd take the time to explain, but there was no time for that right now because he had robots to smash. The city was Izuku's playground as he zipped around on his rollerblades, using the 3D mental projection in his mind to find and target entire groups of villain bots. He skated in, demolished multiple bots with a few well-timed magic words, then without slowing down moved on to the next group of bots, rinse and repeat. The combination of his speed, power, and informational advantages made Izuku totally unbeatable compared to his fellow competitors. He was dominating this test. He was going to get into UA, wasn't he? He felt lightheaded just thinking about it. A couple of two-pointers were rushing down the street chasing after a poor kid with antlers, shooting small sandbags at him. The other student was trying his best to escape, but he was being pummeled. He had an obvious big bruise on his face and likely many more under his clothes. Get restore Bowl B, Izuku said, destroying both bots and allowing the other boy to get away. Izuku felt so bad. If you weren't strong enough to smash the bots or weren't fast or sneaky enough to rip out the wires, then you were pretty much screwed. UA didn't play around. Far from being proper competitors, a lot of students here were unintentionally performing the role of civilians caught up in a villain attack, panicked and despairing looks on their faces and all. It was depressing to watch. He felt awful for all the other kids whose dreams were being crushed in real time. It was so easy for Izuku to imagine himself in the same boat. If he hadn't figured out his quirk, then he would have spent all year practicing stuff like physical fitness tests, judo takedowns, first aid, obstacle courses, and anything else that he thought a hero exam might test him on. He would have been so furious and despondent when he discovered what the exam actually was. Whenever he noticed it happening, he made sure to go after the bots who were chasing after examinees. It seemed like the nice thing to do, and it wasn't like he was giving up any points. Maybe it'd give the other students a chance to catch their breaths and think of a strategy. You couldn't plan when you were panicking. 2 minutes remaining, a teacher shouted over the loudspeaker. The ground shook, and a great long shadow crested the city, looming ominously. Someone screamed, and then more screams followed. Izuku turned to face the commotion and looked up. And up, and up. Izuku barely stopped himself from shrieking. That's the 0-pointer. A robot larger than the surrounding buildings stomped its way through the exam arena, crushing anything unfortunate enough to be in its way. What in the world is Ua thinking? The other examinees around him were screaming and running away from the colossal death machine as fast as they could. Izuku was about to do the same, but a splash of color against the gray concrete stopped Izuku in his tracks. He looked closer, and what he saw terrified him. Oh hell, someone's there. A student was lying there seemingly unconscious in the robot's path of destruction. If it kept its current path, the zero-pointer would crush the kid to death in less than 30 seconds. Swallowing his fear, Izuku skated up to the other student lying face down on the ground. It was a boy with blonde hair. Hey, Izuku shouted, crouching down to shake the boy's shoulder. Are you awake? Can you get up? The boy languidly raised his head and gave him a dumb smile. "We," he said cheerfully, then thumped his head back against the ground. Oh no, he has a concussion, Izuku thought. The zero-pointer was seconds away from crushing them both. Izuku rapidly weighed his odds. He could outskate the robot on his own, but could he do it while dragging along another person? Especially an injured person. Maybe if he lifted the boy in a proper firefighter's carry, but he'd never tried skating while holding someone like that, and would he even have the chance to try? The timing was too tight to risk. Izuku had a better idea anyway. The Colossus's right foot stomped down right near them. That was good. The robot would lift its left leg next, so the right foot would stay put for the next few seconds. Izuku skated to the foot as fast as he could, narrowly avoiding the debris the robot was kicking up all around it. The instant Izuku's hand touched the robot, he rattled out, "Git add 0_pointer_robot, git commit m, bot, git 0_pointer_robot. The zero-pointer robot anticlimactically ceased to exist. The looming shadow disappeared, revealing the sun and bright blue sky. All was quiet. Time's up. The exam is over. Everyone, please return to the entrance. If you're injured, wait where you are and we'll come to you." Izuku let out a relieved sigh. He sat down on the ground and tried to calm his racing heart. That was crazy. That robot was seriously going to kill them. You'd think that Ua had safety measures and the robot would stop before it actually crushed the two of them, but it wasn't even slowing down. It was literally just a step away from killing them. Even if it was programmed to stop, it was cutting it way too close for Izuku's comfort. Izuku breathed deeply, in and out, in and out. He was really tempted not to tell the teachers that he could bring the zero-pointer back. Let them think their wildly expensive iron giant was gone for good. Payback for putting him through that terror. He wouldn't, but he was tempted to. Izuku lay down and looked up at the sky. A smile crept onto his face. He did it. Nedzu scrolled through the Git documentation on his tablet with undisguised glee. When he read that one applicant's quirk was based on an old computer program, he was quite intrigued. The student's file in the quirk registry mentioned that there still existed an instruction manual for the program, partially corrupt. Unfortunately, Nedzu searched through ancient archival data for it so that he could get a better understanding of Midoriya Izuku's abilities. What he found astounded him. He wasn't even pretending to pay attention to the entrance exam anymore. He could review the footage of it later. This was far more interesting. "Principal Nedzu," Vlad King said gravely, eyes focused on a particular screen. "What that student did to the zero-pointer, can he do that to people?" "Oh yes, of course. He has no limits at all," Nedzu chirped. "He could do it to the whole country if he wanted to, at any time, in an instant. I'm certain Git add Japan would work if he tried it. Isn't it wonderful?" Nedzu could smell a wave of terror wash over the pro-heroes in the room. He even smelled it from Aizawa, who he thought was above that sort of thing. How disappointing. Silly humans. It was a common shortcoming with species who were used to being at the top of the food chain. If you spent all your time being afraid of apex predators, then you'd never get anything done in life. They shouldn't be scared of Midoriya Izuku, they should be eager to help him reach his full potential. How could he help his staff understand? Oh, of course, he should go into great detail about the many other world-shattering things Midoriya could do if he chose to. That would help. After all, nothing was scarier than the unknown. To be continued. I hope you enjoyed this story. Also remember to subscribe and like this video. See you in the next video.